Chapter 261. With strange expressions on their faces, the officials walked past Fan Xian and exited Taiji Palace. At this moment, Fan Xian felt a little uneasy. He knew what the situation of the conversation in front of the emperor would be. Even if he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would probably stand out. In the end, his experience and age were too young. But since things had come to this, he could only accept it calmly. With a trace of caution, he followed behind the old officials and followed the eunuch to the back of the palace. After a few turns and 2 turns, they didn't walk very far. They came to a side hall. The ceiling was blocked, so the space didn't seem very spacious. To the left was a large row of wooden shelves that were as tall as a person. The shelves were all filled with books. Fan Xian secretly looked around at the decorations. He knew that this was probably the legendary royal study. A smile appeared at the corner of his lips. He was probably thinking of the braid plays he had often seen in his previous life. At this time, the emperor had already taken off his dragon robe with the help of the eunuchs. He had changed into a sky blue casual shirt with a jade belt tied around his waist. He looked quite casual. The emperor reclined on the low couch and reached out to place a teacup on the table. He casually waved his hand, and the eunuchs hurriedly brought 7 round chairs with embroidered surfaces into the room. The 7 old officials bowed to express their thanks and naturally took their seats. The crown prince and the great prince stood next to the low couch that the emperor was sitting on. Although there were no seats, one could tell from the expressions on their faces that this had always been the rule. However, there had always been 7 chairs in advance. Today, there was an additional young official. The eunuchs of the royal study had probably never seen Fan Xian before, so they were in a bit of a dilemma. They didn't know if he was just a low-ranking official who had been sent in for questioning, or some other noble figure. Everyone was sitting, and Fan Xian was standing alone. This immediately made him stand out. His father, Minister Fan, was looking at his nose and did not even glance at him. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. He moved his already inconspicuous position further back. His small action was noticed by the crown prince. The crown prince smiled slightly at him. Fan Xian only dared to return the gesture with his gaze. Inadvertently, he saw the great prince give a small yawn behind the emperor. He had probably just returned to the capital yesterday and had drunk a lot of wine. He was probably very tired today. Other than the day when they first met in the tea house by the Lujing River, today was the closest Fan Xian had ever been to the emperor. He was so close that he could almost touch the emperor. He couldn't help but raise his head slightly and quickly sweep his eyes over the emperor, but he didn't dare to stare at him. After all, the other party was the emperor. Although there was an official called Mu Tianyan in the Qing dynasty, no one dared to wantonly appreciate him, as if he was a beauty. But it was this quick glance that allowed Fan Xian to clearly see the other's face. He was almost stunned by the look in her eyes. The emperor glanced at him and did not mind his direct stare. Fan Xian's expression showed that he was lucky, but there was no fear in his heart. After a while, the second prince, who was studying with the little prince in Xingqing Palace, was also invited over by a eunuch. When he entered the royal study, he was still holding the little prince's hand. Seeing the harmonious scene between the 2 brothers, the emperor nodded slightly, seemingly satisfied. The crown prince had a smile on his face, but who knew how many profanities he was cursing in his heart. Bring Fan Xian a seat. After the 4 princes all stood next to the low couch, the emperor seemed to notice that Fan Xian was still standing, and casually ordered him. Fan Xian was slightly surprised. I wouldn't dare. Given his rank, entering the royal study was already an exception. These 4 princes were still standing, so how could he dare to sit? When the 6 old officials heard the emperor give this young man a seat, they also felt an itch under their buttocks. They moved, twisted, and coughed. It was clear that they were somewhat dissatisfied. They had been in the court for at least 20 years before they finally had a seat in front of the emperor. Fan Xian, this child of the Fan family, had just entered the royal study and already had a seat. The crown prince looked at the officials and respectfully said to the emperor, "Father, Fan Xian is young, and his body is not as strong as the old officials. Look at how frightened he is. It is better for him to stand." These words were spoken very calmly, and whether it was the old officials or Fan Xian, they all felt grateful. At this time, the great prince spoke again and said, I remember back then when you had us listen to the officials discuss the state. We had to stand because we were going to assist the crown prince in ruling the country and bringing peace to the world. Since it was a lesson, then the students had to act like students. He did not finish, but the meaning was already clear. Fan Xian was young and had just entered officialdom. What achievements did he have? What ability did he have for us princes to treat him like a teacher? The old officials also stroked their beards and shook their heads. This seat looked normal, but the meaning hidden within it was no small matter. They dared to guarantee that if Fan Xian actually had a seat in the royal study, the news would spread throughout Jingdo in less than 3/4 of an hour. Fan Xian was preparing to go with the flow and thank the emperor. Unexpectedly, he saw the indifferent gaze the emperor cast his way. His heart trembled slightly, and he swallowed his words. The emperor glanced at the officials and then at his eldest son, who, although straightforward, had a slightly impatient temperament. He said, Naturally, Fan Xian does not deserve this seat, but today he must sit. It is not to reward him, but to reward him for his service. No one understood what he meant, but since the emperor had spoken, the royal study was naturally silent. The emperor gazed at his sons and said in a gentle voice, If you can also bring back a carriage full of books from Zhuang Mohan's family, I will let you sit as well. Everyone was silent. They all knew what this carriage represented, although they still felt that the emperor was a bit prejudiced when it came to scholarly fame. They did not know how to argue. The emperor knew what everyone was thinking and said coldly, Don't think that this is only a matter of scholars. What is a scholar? You officials are all scholars. I don't lack martial arts. What I lack is the art of governing the country. It's easy to unify the world, but it's difficult to unify the people's hearts. If I don't work hard on this, I won't be able to do it just by relying on swift swords and swift horses. The great prince's face clearly showed his disapproval, but his father had not finished speaking, so he did not dare to say anything. He listened as the emperor continued unhurriedly. You can immediately take over the world, but you cannot immediately rule it. The art of literature seems illusory, but it involves the hearts of all the scholars under heaven. Back in the day, I went on 3 northern expeditions, beating the Wei family into a mess. Who would have thought that the Zhan family would take advantage of the chaos to rise? In just a few years, they gathered a large group of talents, and that is how the court of Northern Qi today came to be. They have stopped our horses from marching north. What do they rely on? They rely on their rightful position in the hearts of all the scholars under heaven. The world is in the right mood. Wasn't this the work of scholars? Xu Wuyan Hangshu, you are officials of the kingdom of Qing, but you took the imperial examinations in Northern Wei. Why is that? Xu the scholar and minister Yin hurriedly stood up, fearful and uneasy. The emperor waved his hand and said, All the scholars under heaven are like this. I do not blame you, and you do not need to doubt yourselves. I just want to tell you that the world is in the right mood, and the loyalty of the scholars will bring many benefits. Each county will have more talented and virtuous officials, and you will also have an advantage in speech. He looked at his eldest son and said coldly, I know what you are thinking, but if when you send out your troops, there will be less resistance and fewer soldiers under your rule will die. Do you not want that? The great prince was silent. The emperor then said coldly, A carriage of old books can help me attract more scholars to travel the world, and can help me save the lives of countless soldiers. Why can't I give Fan Xian this seat? Everyone felt that it was a bit strange. It seemed that the emperor was deliberately showing his favor to the world. And why did Minister Fan not come out to take the seat on his son's behalf? But the entire kingdom of Qing was born in the flames of war, and its people had an overwhelming fanaticism and a sense of mission to unify the world. Since the emperor had linked the books that Fan Xian brought back from this diplomatic mission to the general trend of unifying the world, who dared to say anything more? They all stood up and praised the emperor's wisdom. What direct relationship could a carriage have with the world? Fan Xian thanked the emperor for the seat. His face was calm, and he sat as steady as a mountain. He laughed bitterly in his heart. not understanding why the emperor wanted to put him on top of a fire cage to roast. The red velvet cloth was pulled back, revealing a large map inside. The map had been rearranged. The yellow territory of the kingdom of Qing was continuously extending toward the northeast, and other than the wasteland behind her, everything else was hers. The kingdom of Qing's territory was expanding rapidly. Although northern Qi still looked like a giant, in front of the wild beast that was the kingdom of Qing, it was bloated. Although northern Qi was also a new country, it had not only inherited the vast territory of the Wei Kingdom, but it had also inherited the Wei Kingdom's already rotten bureaucracy and customs. Fan Xian looked at the map and listened to the incessant sounds of discussion. Standing in the heart of the kingdom of Qing, it was the first time he felt the kingdom of Qing's valiant style of doing things and wild ambitions. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. The court in the north still had power. Looking at the thoughts of Haitang and the emperor, once the world was in chaos, the people of the world would inevitably suffer, and he didn't know how long it would take to recover. Although he was not a pacifist who bemoaned the state of the universe and pitted the fate of mankind, he had no interest in such things as war. At this moment, the emperor was discussing important matters of state with a few officials. Occasionally, he would hear a few words about the defense of the river embankments, as well as the annual income and the tributes of the small vassal states. Fan Xian knew nothing of these matters and naturally, he would not interrupt. Even if he had thoughts, sitting on the tiger stool, he would not say a word. Unintentionally or unintentionally, everyone had forgotten about him in a corner of the imperial study. That was why he had the leisure to look at the obviously improved map and stare blankly at it, sighing like a disciple of the Mahist family. Suddenly a word jumped into his ears, the palace treasury. He frowned slightly, and his heart gradually grew wary. The emperor had asked him to stay, and it was not as simple as giving him a stool and giving him face. As you all know, although the palace treasury is called the palace treasury, it is connected to many vital points, the emperor said hatefully. These years, the palace treasury has been in an embarrassing situation. In the third year of the new calendar, when the rivers in the south were dredged, and the north was cold, I ordered the palace treasury to transfer silver to the national treasury. Who knew? The Guanghui treasury could not even produce silver. The Guanghui treasury was one of the 10 treasuries of the palace treasury that specialized in storing banknotes, but the gold and silver should be stored in the undertaking treasury. The emperor's anger seemed to have been directed at the wrong person. But no matter what, the undertaking treasury and the Guanghui treasury were jointly managed by the eldest princess and the Ministry of Revenue. Although the Ministry of Revenue did not dare say a word in these 10 years, the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian, quickly stood up and apologized. The emperor waved his hand and did not even look him in the eye. He continued, "The new policy has come to an end, but I have decided to make an issue of the palace treasury. I do not seek to restore the prosperity of 10 years ago, but at least every year, I want to earn some silver for the court." His voice was not loud, and his tone was not very intense, but the power contained within made everyone afraid to speak. My royal sister has returned to Xinjiang, and there needs to be a high-ranking official to handle this matter. What good candidates do you have in mind? Report them to me. The officials and princes in the royal study all knew that this was just a formality. The capital had long known that the emperor's preferred candidate was Fan Xian, who was sitting quietly in the back. And the emperor had borrowed a vehicle to show off, and vigorously supported Fan Xian to the throne. It was nothing more than a way to show his stance to the officials, so that they would not sing a different tune when it came to choosing the person in charge of the palace treasury. But everyone knew that the situation of the palace treasury was not as bad as the emperor had made it out to be. Every year, the goods that were shipped from Jiangnan to the north earned at least a few million liang of silver for the court. If it were not for the secret business of the palace treasury, the kingdom of Qing would not have the financial resources to expand everywhere. For a moment, a faint jealousy of the Fan family grew. But since the emperor appeared to be so dissatisfied, no matter who took over the palace treasury in the future, they would probably have a headache over the amount of money to hand over every year. Thinking of this, the officials' jealousy and hatred faded a little. But even so, no one was willing to suggest Fan Xian at this time. This was a matter of face, and also a matter of money. No matter how difficult it was to manage the palace treasury, the person in charge would still reap a lot of profit every year. These officials also received generous rewards from Xinyang every year. So how could they not know? The officials did not say anything, and Fan Jian, due to his status, could not recommend his own son. For a moment, the royal study fell into an awkward silence. The emperor did not say anything. He only picked up his teacup and took a small sip. His expression was normal, but no one noticed the coldness in his eyes. I recommend. Everyone in the royal study was shocked. The silence had been broken by two people at the same time, and the two people who spoke at the same time were the crown prince and the second prince. This situation was fascinating. The emperor nodded slightly and said, "Speak." The second prince glanced at the crown prince and smiled slightly apologetically. "Since the crown prince has a good candidate, I am all ears." The emperor glanced at him and did not say anything. The crown prince saw that the second prince was being modest. As the master of the Eastern Palace and the future emperor of Qing, he naturally would not pass on this responsibility. He bowed to his father and said, "Father, I recommend Fan Xian." Everyone in the royal study knew that the Eastern Palace had spared no effort in pulling Fan Xian in. Furthermore, this kind of favor was something they could do at little cost. Unexpectedly, the emperor did not immediately express his stance. Instead, he asked the second prince, "Who are you going to recommend?" The second prince smiled shyly and said, "I am also going to recommend Fan Xian, Sir Fan." The royal study was still quiet, but the emperor swept a meaningful glance over Fan Xian. Fan Xian's expression did not change. He prepared to rise and respond. Unexpectedly, the emperor did not give him the opportunity. He lightly said, "Since you two brothers think Fan Xian can do it, then it is him. After autumn, we will draft an edict. There is no need to send it to the various provinces." With this, the topic was settled. Although this was something that had been decided in the palace when Fan Xian and Lin Wanner married last year, it had been brought up in the royal study and recorded. Naturally, it could not be changed. Thinking of the Fan family's father controlling the national treasury and son controlling the palace treasury, everyone felt a strange feeling in their hearts. This kind of royal favor, this kind of honor, there was no other family in the capital. Looking at the crown prince and the second prince fighting to hand over to Fan Xian, they knew that the status of the Fan family in the years to come would probably only rise and not fall. It was like adding oil to a raging fire. Fan Jian and Fan Xian, father and son, quickly rose to give their thanks and repeatedly expressed their fear. The emperor did not pay them much attention. Instead, he smiled and asked, "Since it has been decided, then I have come to ask you too. Why do you both favor Fan Xian?" The crown prince thought for a moment and then smiled. "I only have a rough idea. Minister Fan has managed the finances of the country and has been very effective. Since Fan Xian is his son, I think he should have some talent in this area." The second prince also smiled and said, "I also think so. Besides, the palace treasury involves many gold, silver and silver objects. It needs a clean and honest official to manage it. I will say something rashly. Nowadays in the officialdom, corruption is the norm. Although there are famous clean and honest officials in each province, most of them are in the local areas. Sir Fan Jr. is brimming with talent. Everyone knows he is a man of literature and nobility. I think it is appropriate for him to manage the palace treasury." Oh, the emperor's expression did not change. He asked, "That makes sense. Is there any other reason?" The crown prince and the second prince looked at each other, feeling a little confused. Could it be that the emperor was using this opportunity to test them? The arrow was knocked on the bowstring, and it had to be fired. The crown prince could only brace himself and say, "Second brother is right." Furthermore, the supervision of the palace treasury has always been the responsibility of the Overwatch Council. Since Sir Fan is the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, I think it will be much more convenient for the two departments to work together. The little prince, who had come in with the second prince, had been standing for a long time. His feet were a little sore. Perhaps he did not understand what the white-bearded officials were saying to his father, so he could not help but feel a little tired. In his daze, he felt a little strange. He laughed and said in a childish voice, "Brother Crown Prince, according to what you say, Fan Xian is supervising himself?" He was a child, so he could speak a little more freely. Others would only think that he was speaking childishly, but it seemed like he was speaking carelessly, but it pointed out the Crown Prince's mistake. Although the officials did not dare to speak, the Crown Prince's face was slightly sullen. Fortunately, the second prince was also distressed. "Father, I really cannot think of anything." The emperor did not rebuke the Crown Prince. He only said lightly, "You cannot think of anything? Then why did you want to protect him earlier?" The people in the royal study saw the emperor's hesitation. He clearly had his heart set on Fan Xian, but he still wanted to make trouble for his two sons. They felt that the emperor's heart was hard to predict, so they could only keep their mouths shut for fear of causing trouble. As the person involved, Fan Xian felt that the tiger's stool under his buttocks was not only pricking, but also burning his buttocks. At this moment, the second prince spoke with a trace of unease. "Actually, there is another reason. Because I have a good personal relationship with Sir Fan." The emperor looked at his second son calmly. After a moment, he suddenly laughed. His laughter seemed very comfortable. "There are thousands of reasons, but this one is enough. What is this palace treasury?" "It is the treasury of the royal family. Since Fan Xian is in charge of the palace treasury, he naturally needs to be close enough to the royal family. Since Fan Xian has worked at Taichung Temple, this closeness is enough." Of course it was enough. No matter what, Fan Xian was a princess consort. No matter what, the crown prince and the second prince often called him brother-in-law. The crown prince listened to this and couldn't help but sigh. He thought that the second prince was indeed amazing. He had actually guessed the answer that the emperor wanted. Why was he a bit slower? Because the army had just returned and the borders had just been settled. Today's meeting was a bit longer than usual. It was actually past lunchtime. The emperor looked at the time and ordered the eunuchs to prepare food. He had the officials and princes stay behind to eat together. This was the first time Fan Xian had eaten something made by the royal kitchen. He didn't think there was anything special about it. It was just some vegetables, fish, and chicken. What made him feel even more comfortable was that eating with the emperor was not as uncomfortable as he had imagined. He didn't have to kowtow again before eating. The crown prince's and the second prince's earlier words all fell into his ears. He knew he couldn't hide. When he looked again at the middle-aged man on the dragon couch, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of wariness and coldness in his heart. The emperor's favor was based on some absurd fact, but he didn't think that an emperor would have such a rare thing as family. Fan Xian was not a person who was easy to control. He could kneel, endure, and listen. However, when something threatened his bottom line, he would smile and touch his left calf. He could not kneel, endure, or listen. He would only say, "Fuck you." The crown prince and the princes obediently waited on the emperor as he ate. They then went to eat in the side palace. The emperor was chatting with a few old officials. Naturally, they didn't talk about national affairs at the table. Instead, they talked about whose well water was the best to make tea, which province's watermelons were as big as boulders, and so on. His voice was a bit loud, and it reached the ears of the princes who were eating in the next room. The great prince frowned, but the crown prince smiled, feeling even more confident that his decision to win over the Fan family was a wise one. He looked at his second brother's face and found that his expression hadn't changed. He was still as calm and unhurried as he had been all these years. He even seemed a bit strange, as he chewed his food slowly and continuously. He couldn't help but curse his hypocrisy in his heart. Inside and outside the palace where the royal study was, there was laughter and the sound of praising the emperor. Who knew the troubles and pain in Fan Xian's heart? When Fan Xian stepped out of the palace in the afterglow of the sun, he saw the crown prince on horseback at the entrance of the new street. His troubles grew. Crown Prince Jing Li Hongcheng came to greet him with a face full of joy. His face showed the joy of meeting again after a long time, and there was no real emotion in his heart. The sun was setting in the west, and night was coming. Chapter 262. In a corner of the square outside the palace, on a street that connected to Zinjiku, one could vaguely see a bashful crescent moon hanging in the sky. In the dusk, Li Hongqing dismounted from his horse and casually cupped his hands in greeting. He looked at his friend, who was as pretty as a woman, and couldn't help but smile. I see that your face is glowing with a red light. It's indescribably colorful. I think you must have gained a lot today. Fan Xian laughed. We haven't seen each other in months, and the first thing you say is to make fun of me. You are the crown prince of King Jing, the fifth most powerful young master in the capital. Why make life difficult for a poor person like me? Other than the four princes, among the younger generation, Li Hongqing's status was naturally the most respected. Fan Xian had purposely placed him as the fifth young master. If it had been a normal friendship, it would inevitably have seemed frivolous. But between the two of them, it seemed very intimate. Li Hongqing was a little surprised. This guy had always been too lazy to provoke me in the capital. His gentle smile always carried a trace of deeply hidden loneliness. Why had his personality changed today? Thinking of something, he thought he understood and laughed. You also have a poor life? His Majesty dotes on you so much that after the court discussion, he deliberately kept you here. I'm afraid that the officials in the capital would grit their teeth and bear such a hard life. Fan Xian waved his hand and said nothing. Teng Zijing, who had been waiting outside the palace, had long since come to greet them. But seeing that the crown prince was talking to the young master, he didn't dare interrupt. Young master, he hurriedly said. The old master told me to follow you. Li Hongqing laughed. What? Master Fan? Are you worried that I will get Fan Xian drunk? Then follow me, Fan Xian said from the side. As they spoke, Fan Xian's carriage drove over. Li Hongqing was just letting the prince's attendant bring the horse over. He turned his head and asked curiously, What? Do you still only want to ride in a carriage and not on a horse? I'm not in a hurry, said Fan Xian. Why would I ride a horse? Li Hongqing couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. If it weren't for the fact that the people of the capital know that you are skilled in both literature and martial arts, I'm afraid they would look down on you and think you are just a useless scholar without the strength to truss a chicken. The Qing kingdom revered martial arts. Young people were proud of being good at riding, but Fan Xian did the opposite. When there was a carriage, he refused to ride a horse. This strange habit had long spread throughout Jingdo this year. Fan Xian laughed and scolded him. He walked towards the carriage and said, Riding a horse hurts my butt. The guards of King Jing's manor had already surrounded them. Together with the guards and servants of Fan Manor, they formed a small group of a dozen or so people. They surrounded a large horse and an unremarkable black carriage, slowly heading east of the city. There was no curfew in Jingdo. Although it was already dusk, there were still many people on the streets. Seeing this eye-catching group, seeing the handsome young man on the horse, and seeing the square insignia on the carriage, they knew who the two people were. The people of Jingdo all knew of the diplomatic mission's return. Since they were traveling with Crown Prince Jing, they assumed that the person in the carriage was the legendary illegitimate child of the Fan family, Sir Fan Jr. They couldn't help but stop and watch. Some of the bolder students even called out to the carriage, Immortal fan of poetry, immortal fan of poetry. Last year's banquet in front of the palace hall had been talked about by the people of Jingdo for a long time. And this time, Zhuang Mohan's gift of a book in Northern Qi, with the intentional help of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had become a well-known anecdote. Fan Xian's reputation had taken another step forward. Later, the poem, do you know? Later, when the poem Immortal of Poetry began to spread, the people learned that Sir Fan Jr. had dared to flirt with Grandmaster Ku He's female disciple in Shangjing, Northern Qi, in front of countless young nobles of Northern Qi. Every time the people of Jingdo thought of this, they felt their hearts grow hotter. It was as if this matter was even more glorious than Zhuang Mohan's gift of a book. The begonia that you worship like a saint, in the hands of Sir Fan Jr., is no more than a flower bud waiting to be plucked. Fan Xian had brought face to the people of Jingdo, and naturally the people of Jingdo had to bring face to Sir Fan Jr. Along the way, people constantly greeted Fan Xian on the street. Most of them were scholars. Occasionally, there would be a girl with a shy expression bowing to him. Sir Fan Jr. had won the hearts of the people of Jingdo. Naturally, the people of Jingdo had overlooked Crown Prince Jing, even though he was the most arrogant person in the capital. However, Crown Prince Jing's face did not show any displeasure. On the contrary, he smiled happily. It seemed that the respect Fan Xian received was also his honor. Listening to the chatter and greetings outside the carriage, it was reasonable to say that Fan Xian, at this moment, would not open the window and wave his hand in greeting like the chief of his previous life. At the very least, there should be a satisfied smile on his face. But who would have thought that inside the carriage, there was only a helpless, bitter smile on his lips. The place the Crown Prince had arranged for Fan Xian to receive him was still Yishir Tavern. It was the restaurant where Fan Xian had spoken of his strength of character when he had first arrived in the capital. This restaurant could be considered a luxurious place in Jingdo, but it was not quiet enough. It was far from the best restaurant. Fan Xian couldn't help but not understand why Hongqing would choose such a place, but he didn't have any objections. When he got off the carriage, he realized that Yishir Tavern was unexpectedly quiet. There were not many people on the long street in front of the building, and the usually bustling building was even quieter. Fortunately, the building was brightly lit. Otherwise, he would have wondered if, in the months that he had been away, this second-to-none golden restaurant might have closed because of business failure. Seeing the doubt in the corner of Fan Xian's eyes, Li Hongqing did not deliberately mystify him. He smiled and said, "I'll take care of everything today." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Although you are a great crown prince, this is too much of a scene. Who knows how many high officials and nobles come and go to Yishir Tavern every day. For the sake of inviting me to dinner, you have caused others to suffer. I'm afraid they will be jealous. If you want peace and quiet, there are many places in the west of the city. Even if you like the taste here, you can reserve a whole floor. To have an entire restaurant waiting for the two of us is too ostentatious. Even if King Jing doesn't scold you, it won't be good if word gets out to the palace." Li Hongqing saw the sincerity in Fan Xian's words, and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. He felt touched and smiled. "What are you afraid of? I'm afraid everyone in the world knows that my father loves to grow flowers, and I love to pluck them. I've always been impulsive. I can't get rid of the title of a licentious crown prince. What does it matter?" Fan Xian knew that, given his status, he could afford to put on such airs. He smiled and shook his head. "You're about to get married, and you don't know how to restrain yourself." Hearing him talk about marriage, Li Hongqing's face showed a faint joy, but he was a bit embarrassed to talk about it. "Don't be too careful," he said. "You have a lot of power in your hands, and you've married a good wife. Let me be frank with you. In the palace and the manor, we of the younger generation have to know our limits. But once we leave the palace and the manor, we are the real masters. Let other people talk." These words were impulsive, exaggerated, and arrogant, but coming from Li Hongqing's mouth, they didn't provoke disgust. Fan Xian had been suppressing a bellyful of boredom in the palace, so he just smiled and followed Li Hongqing into the building. When they reached the bottom of the building, they saw the words Yishir Tavern written by Sir Pan Ling himself. Li Hongqing stopped and pointed. "Do you remember where we first met?" he asked. Fan Xian smiled. "It's here." "Yes, in just a short span of a year, you, the person who made such harsh remarks and repeatedly said that you looked down on so-called gifted scholars, has now become the most famous great scholar in the world." Li Hongqing couldn't help but shake his head and laugh. "If you could think of the great Zhuang Mohan passing on his legacy to you, would you still be in the mood to scold those scholars?" Fan Xian thought of the events of the past year, and he couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. He sighed. "I don't care if you laugh at me, but at the time, I was just an illegitimate child who had just arrived in the capital. I had never seen anything, so I couldn't help but have a few baskets of complaints." Li Hongqing looked at him with a smile. He knew that the reason why this young friend of his had changed so much in a year was because of the emperor's favor, Minister Fan's secret protection, and a marriage alliance. But for him to become the commissioner of the Overwatch Council at such a young age, and to have a seat in the royal study, it would have been impossible without some real talent. Furthermore, the Banksian's high poetry anthology had appeared several times, and that was proof for all to see. As for the duties of the Overwatch Council, the nobles in the capital didn't actually connect Chen Pingping with Fan Xian. They just thought that it was the emperor's will, and that Chen Pingping, that loyal dog, was simply following orders. Although you always drag me around Lujing River, I don't rely on my talent to fool poor women. Fan Xian looked at the startled Li Hongqing and laughed as he patted him on the shoulder. So I still have to scold those dog-T scholars. In his heart, Haiyang, who had been fooled by his poetry, was not a poor woman. The two of them stood in front of Yisher Tavern, reminiscing about the past and feeling deeply moved. Inside the tavern, the shopkeepers and waiters were extremely nervous. Although they didn't know how the owner had managed to invite the Crown Prince to hold a welcoming banquet here. If Sir Fan Jr.'s first meal after returning to the capital was at Yisher Tavern, not only would the reputation of the tavern go up a notch, but in the future, rich scholars from Jiangnan would all pick this place to eat. Wouldn't that be a waste of money? Although Yisher Tavern was already famous enough, who would complain about having more of these three things? Fame, power, and money? Fortunately, they didn't have to be nervous for long. Li Hongqing and Fan Xian had already walked into the tavern, arm in arm. The guards from the prince's manor, who had been guarding the two ends of the street behind them, immediately withdrew and stood guard at the entrance of the tavern. At the same time, waiters had already led Fan Manor's carriages and attendants elsewhere. With a creak, the door to Yisher Tavern closed. This was probably the first time in the 34 years since the tavern opened in the capital. As the door closed, Li Hongqing seemed to inadvertently turn his head, and his sharp eyes discovered a few secret agents in ordinary clothing, occupying important areas around the tavern. He knew that they were the Overwatch Council's personal bodyguards, but even he wasn't sure which bureau they were from. The Crown Prince sighed to himself and said to Fan Xian, "And you say I'm arrogant? You have the Overwatch Council guarding your door when you eat, and the Tiger Guards protecting you when you go on diplomatic missions. When it comes to arrogance, I really can't compare to you." At that moment, the two of them had already ascended the stairs to the third floor. Separated by two screens, a small round table was already set up with a few plates of exquisite cold noodles. Fan Xian didn't stand on ceremony with him. He sat down on a stool and explained, "The Tiger Guards are assigned to the diplomatic mission, and they were taken back when we returned to the capital. As for the Overwatch Council," he laughed bitterly, "after the Nyolan Street incident, do you think the council would dare to let me wander around the capital alone?" At this point, Li Hongqing pretended to be angry and scolded him. "You're not a good person, kid. You quietly became the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Seeing how nervous the council was after the Nyolan Street incident, I think you were already. If it weren't for the incident at the Ministry of Justice, I would still be in the dark." Thinking about it, during the Nyolan Street incident, Fan Xian hadn't alerted the emperor with his one night of poetry. The Crown Prince was actually trying to get information out of him. It wasn't just him. Even the second prince couldn't completely understand why the emperor trusted Fan Xian so much. Fan Xian didn't explain. He wiped his hands with a hot towel and began to drink, saying that he had been away for so long that he had forgotten the taste of wine in the capital. Li Hongqing laughed bitterly. He knew that Fan Xian wouldn't explain. Not long after, the first round of dishes arrived. Knowing that the Crown Prince and Sir Fan Jr. had something to say, the waiters tactfully said nothing more and left. Fan Xian used the tip of his chopsticks to slice off a piece of fish belly and put it into his mouth. He smacked it a few times and drank a mouthful of wine. He seemed to be enjoying it to the extreme. Li Hongqing looked him up and down and laughed. "Instead of eating a first-rate bear paw, you make life difficult for a fish. You still can't escape your narrow-mindedness." Fan Xian blurted out, "The bear paw is what I want, and the fish is what I want. If I can't have both, I have to give up the bear paw and take the fish." Hearing his amusing words, Li Hongqing laughed. "Why?" Fan Xian slapped his head and laughed. "You don't understand. It's purely because you were too pedantic in your studies. Since it was a welcoming banquet, it shouldn't have been so deserted." But Fan Xian had already sent a message last night, asking the crown prince not to bring a large group of people to accompany him on the arduous journey. In addition, the crown prince faintly knew that because of the song, Fan Xian's backyard was on fire, so he didn't call for the singers to accompany him. But Li Hongqing was also a son of an influential family, who was used to treating people gently. The two of them were familiar with each other. They talked about what they had seen in northern Qi, chatted, drank, and ate. It was light but satisfying. Fan Xian could finally be 70% his true self. On the contrary, he ate with great ease. After a few rounds of drinking, the crown prince couldn't take it anymore. He pointed at Fan Xian and scolded him. I heard that you drank in northern Qi and got drunk as soon as you drank. How come you're a wine immortal in front of me? Fan Xian was a master of medicine, and the Jinqi in his body was tyrannical. He couldn't be made drunk by a few cups of wine. Last time in northern Qi, when he was drinking with Haidang, he got drunk because he wanted to vent his years of depression. Hearing Li Hongqing's words, he laughed. You're a man. What good is it for me to get drunk in front of you? Li Hongqing suddenly looked fascinated. That Haidang girl, is she really as beautiful as a fairy? He asked quietly. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of wine. Fortunately, he spat it out quickly, and it only hit the ground. He laughed and scolded him. Could it be that you invited me to dinner today, just to say this? After 3 rounds of drinking, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. Li Hongqing became drunk. He pointed at Fan Xian's delicate face and said, Fan Xian, I don't know what happened to you on this trip. Looking at your face now, it's a bit different. Fan Xian unconsciously touched his face. What's different? He asked curiously. Li Hongqing scratched his head and spilled wine all over the floor. It seemed that he was thinking about how to phrase it. After a while, he laughed loudly. If you were in the past, you would have a faint smile like you do now. You would make people want to get close to you, but there would always be a barrier, as if you didn't want others to get too close to you. But now, your smile doesn't have that purposeful purity. It just makes people feel at ease, and their eyes are clear. Whether it's your speech or your actions, it's like a polished piece of jade, incomparably warm. Fan Xian smiled, fitting the scene perfectly. He thought that this was probably the change that night in the cave had brought to him. He finally understood some things. From the depths of his heart, he began to see himself as a part of this world. He began to make real plans for his future. Starting from the inside, and showing it on the outside, there would naturally be changes. Li Hongqing gradually became drunk, but Fan Xian was incomparably sober. I know. Today, the palace has decided that you'll be in charge of the palace treasury. Li Hongqing seemed a little drunk. In the future, you'll have to leave some soup in your hands for me. Although it was a naughty joke, for him to say it as a prince was already giving Fan Xian enough face. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a little surprised. He looked at him and quietly asked, Your family is a hereditary nobility. Why do you care about these things? Do you think the emperor owes you anything? Li Hongqing had a mocking expression on his face. He stuck out his tongue and said, You know I spend a lot. Even though there is a shopkeeper in Qingyu Hall helping the manor manage its finances, and there is some income, it is not enough. He sighed. You also know that even though my brother is the emperor's blood brother, he has not been willing to do anything all these years. Even when he enters the palace to see grandmother, it is only once a month. He is very stubborn. As an idle king, naturally there are not many people who show filial piety. And because of my status, it's not good for me to put down my pride and interact with those governors. Naturally, there will be times when I don't have the time. Fan Xian seemed a little surprised. He didn't know what to say. If this was said outside, no one would believe it. Li Hongqing waved his hand. The smell of alcohol permeated the air. He laughed coldly. An empty title of nobility is useless. You don't need to be embarrassed. The palace treasury belongs to the court. When it's time for you to fish, don't be shy. Think about all these years my aunt has been managing the palace treasury. Who knows how much the crown prince has benefited from it? Even when the Guo family was raided by you, they took 130,000 liang of silver. The palace treasury is empty? If you go to the crown prince's palace in Wuzhou, you'll know where the people's blood and sweat went. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew that the prince's words were specifically meant for him to hear. Looking at Crown Prince Jing, drunk on the table, Fan Xian smiled coldly. It seemed that Uncle Wu Zhu was right. There was no one in this world worth trusting. On the trip to northern Qi, he had many feelings. He knew that friendship was hard to come by. Even though he knew that Li Hongqing was using the excuse of welcoming him to represent the second prince in announcing his close relationship with the second prince to the capital, he still didn't refuse. But he didn't expect the crown prince to tell such a big lie in front of him. Li Hongqing, Crown Prince Jing, was one of Fan Xian's trusted subordinates. He had been secretly managing all the flesh business on Lujing River. Although it wasn't a glorious business, and didn't seem to match the crown prince's status, it provided him with a steady stream of silver. The crown prince's actions were extremely secretive. If Fan Xian hadn't sent people to investigate Yuan Meng last summer, perhaps even the second bureau of the Overwatch Council wouldn't know about this matter. No wonder he dared to cry poor in front of Fan Xian. But Fan Xian also knew that the second prince wasn't necessarily interested in the money in the palace treasury. It was just that while the eldest princess of Xinjiang was at the helm, the Eastern Palace must have done a lot of work in the palace treasury. Perhaps the second prince was relying on Fan Xian and wanted to use this to topple the crown prince. And he also understood that there was truth in the crown prince's words. There were indeed some nobles who didn't live as they pleased. Even Fan Xian himself, if he didn't have the support of the bookstore and the head steward of the national treasury, would have to stretch out his hands everywhere. Without anyone to show him respect, did he have to rely on the government's salary? The banquet was over, and the wine was finished. Fan Xian patted Li Hongqing twice. Seeing no reaction, he didn't care whether Li Hongqing was really drunk or just pretending to be drunk. He pretended to stagger, stood up and walked out. The innkeeper had already informed the attendants on both sides to wait on him. The wooden door of Yisher Tavern opened, and the early autumn wind blew in. Fan Xian shook his head. He tried to treat his friend with sincerity, but there was no response. He couldn't help but feel disappointed. At that moment, a plainly dressed middle-aged man appeared out of nowhere and bowed to Fan Xian in fear and trepidation. Fan Xian turned slightly and frowned. If Li Hongqing had booked the entire tavern, and there were guards outside, how did this man get in? The man saw the confusion on Fan Xian's face and hurriedly replied humbly, "I am Cui Qingchuan, the owner of Yisher Tavern." "Greetings, Master Fan." So it was the owner of Yisher Tavern. He had probably come to flatter Fan Xian. Fan Xian was about to smile when he suddenly remembered the family name. "Cui?" he asked, frowning. Cui Qingchuan carefully smiled. "That's right. The elders of the clan wanted to come and thank you for your kindness in teaching the second son in the north. But they know that Master Fan is a scholar and doesn't like to do things like this, so they ordered me to serve you well today." Fan Xian nodded expressionlessly. He knew that the Cui clan was a famous family with roots in the capital. They did business in the north, and Master Cui, who had knelt in the rainy night of the diplomatic mission and begged for his life, was one of them. Presumably, the Cui clan knew that their son had offended Fan Xian, and so they had done everything they could to smooth things over. Cui Qingchuan tactfully did not step forward. He only handed over a box. "This is a dwarf ginseng. Although it's not very nutritious, it's best used to sober up a hangover. It's been washed, and it's best to chew it raw." Fan Xian nodded, and Teng Zijing took it from him. In the carriage, Fan Xian opened the box on his knees. There was no dwarf ginseng, but a thick stack of banknotes. He frowned and flipped it over. There were 20,000 taels of silver in it. Teng Zijing sat across from him and said, dumbfounded, "The Cui clan is very generous." Fan Xian's expression did not change, but he was actually a little surprised. This was the income of Dambo bookstore, and yet they had delivered it so easily. Of course, he also understood that if the Cui clan still wanted to do business in the north with the palace treasury, they would have to curry favor with him. Thinking of the courteous treatment he had received on his way out of the palace, he couldn't help but sigh. Although he had lived 2 lives, and his temperament was much firmer than that of the average person, at this moment, he truly felt the feeling of power, and he felt a little lost. But the Cui clan had given him this money for nothing. Since Fan Xian had already made up his mind, in the future, the Chui clan would only be able to accompany the eldest princess in death. Thinking of this, his dislike for the crown prince lessened a little. After all, people only had one life, and in the end, they were just using each other. But he did not like that Li Hongqing treated him like a fool. And in the end, he still wanted to keep this friend. Tung Zijing looked at the young master's face, and knew what he was thinking. He frowned. Is this appropriate? Fan Xian looked at him and smiled. The crown prince gave me a sentence earlier. After leaving the palace and the manor, I am a true lord. What is inappropriate about that? The carriage arrived at a secluded alley. The moon in the sky was near its zenith, and its silvery light was soft. Fan Xian got off the carriage, and let the people of the manor return first. Tung Zijing knew that Fan Xian was secretly protected by a team of Overwatch Council officials, so he said nothing. He waved at a shadow, and an Overwatch Council secret agent quietly walked over. He was also in the first batch of people from the Qinian unit, and could be considered Fan Xian's closest confidant. Fan Xian looked at him. Deng Ziyue tomorrow. Send a secret order back to the council. Investigate the Minister of Appointments, the Imperial Astronomer, and the Deputy Imperial Messenger of the Left. See if they have anything to do with the Chui clan's businesses. Deng Ziyue suddenly raised his head. His eyes were wide and bright. Sir, without an edict, we cannot investigate the royal family. His rank in the Overwatch Council was extremely high, so he vaguely knew that behind these three officials was the second prince. Fan Xian frowned and waved his hand. It's just a few officials secretly investigating. What are you afraid of? Deng Ziyue knew that his performance had already dissatisfied the commissioner, and he hurriedly agreed. Fan Xian looked at him and added, Wang Qinian knows what to ask and what not to ask. Since you have taken over his position, you must learn this. Deng Ziyue fearfully accepted the order. Then he saw a box suddenly appear in front of him. He didn't dare open it, so he could only hold it in his arms and walk with Fan Xian, who was strolling with his hands behind his back. Finally, he gathered his courage and asked, Sir, from now on, how can I contact the council? He didn't know if this was something he should ask. Fan Xian stopped walking and smiled. Don't go through the official channels. That will be recorded. Go directly to Mu Tai of the First Bureau. Yes. Fan Xian walked forward. It was rare for him to appreciate the capital late at night after a long absence. He didn't want to let go of this opportunity, so he only said one sentence. This box is not for you. It's for you. Chapter 263. The nights in the capital were quieter than those in Shangjing, northern Qi. The people of the Qing kingdom were not used to the so-called Golden Age, so most of the time, they were used to staying at home at night. Of course, the pleasure boats on the Lujing River and the brothels in the west of the city were not included. Fan Xian put his hands behind his back and walked slowly through the night. Deng Ziyue held a box and followed a few steps behind him. Suddenly, Fan Xian stopped and waved his hand toward the darkness in front of and behind him. The Overwatch Council officials hidden in the darkness responsible for his safety revealed themselves somewhat unknowingly. Everyone in the capital knows you are by my side. Why deliberately stay in the dark? Fan Xian said with a smile. Deng Ziyue explained with a wry smile. The court officials do not like to see the Overwatch Council spies on the streets. The common people are also afraid. I'm afraid it will have a bad effect on you, sir. Fan Xian understood what he meant. He smiled and said, You always walk on people's roofs. Aren't you afraid you'll disturb people's sleep? The subordinates looked at each other, but they followed Commissioner Fan's orders and came to the streets. These people were all officials who had not been very successful in the Overwatch Council. When Wang Qinian was ordered to form the Qinian unit, he had put in a lot of thought and found people who were suitable. Now that the people of the Qinian unit were following Commissioner Fan, it could be said that they were riding on the crest of success in the council. No matter which of the 8 bureaus they went to do business with, they were always respectful. Furthermore, other than their monthly salary, they also received a large allowance. This kind of change made them feel that following Commissioner Fan was a very fortunate thing. It was near the middle of the night, and the temperature was dropping. Deng Ziyu hurried forward a few steps and put a thin black windbreaker on Fan Xian's body. He then immediately returned to his position. A group of 7 or 8 people walked forward. Everyone wore the black unlined clothing that the Overwatch Council had specially made. The hem was above the knee. The material did not reflect much light, and it gave off a gloomy feeling. Under the moonlight, the group maintained a very meaningful distance. Silently and synchronously, they surrounded Fan Xian in the center and walked forward. The silver light was like snow, and the black clothes were like ink. The next day, Fan Xian went to the building next to Tianhe Avenue, the Overwatch Council. As he walked in, calm-faced officials of the Overwatch Council bowed to him. "Good morning, Commissioner Fan." "Good morning, Commissioner Fan." He smiled and responded to them one by one. Without stopping, he walked towards the room at the back of the courtyard. He pushed the door open and found that the 7 heads of the 8 bureaus were all present. Fan Xian bowed slightly and cupped his hands in salute to the crowd. The 7 leaders did not dare to be arrogant and quickly stood up to return the salute. Yin Ruohai of the 4th Bureau, in particular, looked at Fan Xian with an expression of joy and gratitude. It seemed that he had spent the past 2 days at home with Yin Bingyan and his son, and was in a good mood. Only Chen Pingping, sitting in the wheelchair at the end of the long table, looked at him with a faint smile. He coughed and sat on the seat to the right of Chen Pingping. He was somewhat surprised to not see his teacher. As if guessing what he was thinking, Chen Pingping gently rubbed his knees and said in a slightly sharp voice, "He went to Jiangnan to have fun. I can't control him." Fan Xian smiled and lowered his voice. Looking ahead, he said, "When are you going out to play?" Chen Pingping glanced at him and said, "That depends on when you have the ability to take over." The Overwatch Council rarely held these kinds of meetings, and Fan Xian had coincidentally run into them both times he came. Of course, these 2 meetings were inextricably linked to him. After listening to Fan Xian's report on his trip to northern Qi, the officials all relaxed. As long as the spy network in the north had not been fatally destroyed, nothing else mattered. As for Fan Xian nominating Wang Qinian to temporarily handle affairs in the north, no one had much objection. For one, Fan Xian had this power as commissioner. Secondly, Wang Qinian had been in the council for a long time. If he had not failed to live up to expectations in the beginning, he was afraid that by now he would also be a leader. Since he had coincidentally followed Commissioner Fan, it was not out of line for Commissioner Fan to promote one of his own upper rank. Third, the business in the north was a dangerous one. Just look at what happened to the son of the Yin family in the 4th Bureau. But the following announcement of the council's personnel arrangements was somewhat unexpected. The officials of the council had always thought that after Zhu Gu of the 1st Bureau committed suicide, the position that had been left empty, and the reason why the director had not called for anyone to take over was because he wanted to wait for Yin Bingyan to return to the country. Unexpectedly, the director announced that Yin Bingyan would be appointed as the head of the 4th Bureau. If he went to the 4th Bureau, who would be in charge of the 1st Bureau? What about Sir Yin Ruohai? Chen Pingping raised his eyes weakly and said, "Ruohai has been in the council for too long. He is a bit tired of it, so he has asked to resign from his position in the 4th Bureau. Tomorrow, he will send a letter to the Ministry of Appointments and find a position in the capital to enjoy his retirement." From the looks of it, Chen Pingping was not very happy about Yin Ruohai's voluntary resignation. But Yin Ruohai had been worried about his son's life every day for the past year, and was actually somewhat tired of life in the council. In addition, he knew that the council's 8 bureaus could not allow 2 heads of the Yin family to appear at the same time. In order to make room for Yin Bingyan, he could only rush to resign first. The heads of the Overwatch Council's 8 bureaus did not seem to have a high rank, but in reality, they held great power in their hands. Even the vice ministers of the various ministries did not dare to offend them. Fan Xian looked at Yin Ruohai and found that the corners of his eyes were indeed a bit tired. But there was also a hint of relief and joy. Since the director and Sir Yen had already made arrangements for the 4th Bureau, no one said anything more. At that moment, the head of the 2nd Bureau asked, "The position of the 1st Bureau has been empty for so long. Someone has to take care of it. Mutai. He shook his head and said, his loyalty is unparalleled, but he only knows how to flatter. His ability is still a bit weak. The First Bureau is one of the most important departments in the council, and it is in charge of supervising the officials in the capital. The other chiefs also nodded in agreement. The First Bureau was the brightest position among the 8 bureaus. Since these bosses of the 8 bureaus did not retreat bravely like Yin Ruahai, they naturally all wanted to advance further. Chen Pingping slowly turned his head and looked at Fan Xian, who still had a suspicious look on his face. He said, from today onwards, there will be no head of the First Bureau. Commissioner Fan will have full authority to manage it. These words were spoken lightly, but they carried a heavy weight in the hearts of everyone present. Immediately, the desire to fight for power in their hearts was completely dispelled. No one dared to fight with Commissioner Fan. He had always been their superior, and it was clear that he would one day take over from Director Chen. Now that he was in charge of the First Bureau, who dared to say anything? But everyone's hearts were filled with awe. The power of the commissioner was already limited, and now that Sir Fan was in charge of the First Bureau, the affairs of the First Bureau would no longer need to be personally arranged by the council. Instead, the other departments would have to cooperate with the First Bureau. In this way, the status of the First Bureau would probably increase by half a level. In other words, Commissioner Fan was the ruler of the First Bureau. Whatever he said, the First Bureau would do. Fan Xian was also a bit surprised. Why would Chen Pingping want him to manage the First Bureau? He turned to look at him and said, Director, I am already very reluctant to be the commissioner. I have never handled any specific affairs. If I were to suddenly manage the First Bureau, I am afraid it would not be of any benefit to the council. Chen Pingping's words set the tone. You have no experience with specific affairs, so I am giving you the First Bureau so that you can gain some experience. After the meeting ended, all the subordinates in the council congratulated Fan Xian. But the atmosphere of the Overwatch Council was better than that of the other departments in the court, so Fan Xian didn't hear too much flattery. As the officials left, Yin Ruahai stayed behind and expressed his thanks to Fan Xian. Fan Xian felt a bit ashamed of himself. He quickly smiled and said, Bing Yun and I felt like old friends when we first met. Besides, it was all council business. I really didn't do much. Please don't say that, Sir Yen. I am ashamed. Yen Ruahai saw that Fan Xian did not take credit for himself, and admired the young nobleman even more. He smiled and patted Fan Xian on the shoulder. In a few days, I will send an invitation for Master Fan to visit us. Of course. Fan Xian wouldn't refuse. He also wondered what Lady Shun was like in Yin Manor. Only Chen Pingping and Fan Xian were left in the room. Nonsense station. Chen Pingping frowned and looked at him. I know that Bing Yin is a calm child, and would never bring that woman back to the capital. I think it was all your idea. Everyone was afraid of Chen Pingping, but Fan Xian always laughed, and played the role of a junior in front of him. After complaining about being wronged, he said, Director, this has nothing to do with me. When Lady Shin entered the diplomatic mission, she stayed in the eldest princess carriage the entire time. I couldn't forcibly drag her down and kill her. Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes. On the way back to the capital, I had the Black Knights follow the diplomatic mission. If it weren't for your instructions, how could that woman have charged into the diplomatic mission alone? Fan Xian didn't know how to explain. After a while he sighed. At least it wasn't an ill-fated relationship. Chen Pingping loved this young man dearly, and he couldn't bear to reprimand him. Why did you have the Chinian unit reveal their whereabouts? Fan Xian knew he couldn't hide this from him, and he had already thought of an answer. He smiled and said, Because I wanted the council to be more open and above board. There was no need to always hide in the dark and make so many people afraid of us. Open and above board? Chen Pingping frowned. It's good that you have such thoughts. Fan Xian pulled up the blanket on his knees and said quietly, Take your time. There's no rush. Chapter 264. Seize every moment. How can I not be anxious? Chen Pingping's thin face was expressionless. His smooth, beardless chin made the wrinkles on his face seem even deeper. He looked very old. Remember, I am not much younger than Xiaowen. Fan Xian was silent. He could smell some sort of gray aura from the old cripple in front of him. He forced himself to calm down and reported some of the secrets that had occurred on his journey, but he did not reveal that he had talked with Xiaowen all night in the cave, and that he already knew the specific location of the temple. When can Sea Lily enter the palace? Chen Pingping seemed to be very confident in controlling that woman from 1,000 miles away. Fan Xian frowned slightly, wondering when he would be able to get in touch with Sea Lily's brother. I'm making arrangements with some people. For the Northern Qi court, this isn't a big deal. It shouldn't be difficult. Chen Pingping nodded. You know, the first bureau's position was originally reserved for Yin Bingyun. I didn't expect Yin Ruohai to want to retire at such a young age. Yin Bingyun has always worked for his father, and is very familiar with the fourth bureau. Staying there is not a bad choice. But the first bureau has been thrown to you. You need to be careful. Fan Xian squinted. Is there anything I need to be careful of? Chen Pingping looked into his eyes with a strange smile. There are many things you need to be careful of. In fact, His Majesty has always hoped that you would pick up the first bureau. After all, there are many officials in the capital. If you don't keep a close eye on them, and let them get too close to the princes, there will always be some trouble. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He began to secretly curse that person in the palace. Your sons are making a ruckus. Why do I have to put out the fire? Chen Pingping's withered fingers gently tapped on the armrest of the wheelchair. His knuckles protruded like the joints of bamboo. Fan Xian turned to look, and heard the tapping of the armrest. Only then did he realize that the armrest was hollow, just like bamboo. He couldn't help but have a strange thought. This most strict and terrifying old man in the Qing kingdom was as temperamental as bamboo in the wind? You did well in the north this time, Chen Pingping said. You had Wang Qinian stay there. I know what you want to do, but as long as His Majesty doesn't say anything, you can't make a move. Fan Xian frowned and said, The eldest princess made a lot of money from that line. You also know that I will be taking over the palace treasury after the new year. If I do not clean up this mess before I take over, I will not be able to produce results. How can I explain it to the world? Chen Pingping glanced at him and said, The Cui family sells goods to the north on behalf of the eldest princess. If you cut off this line, is there anyone suitable to take over? Fan Xian thought he had something to introduce, so he put on an expression that said he was all ears. Chen Pingping waved his hand. I will report this matter to the emperor. The emperor also feels that the eldest princess has stretched her hand too far these past few years. But after all, we are one family. If he is not willing to relent, then you should not act. You must know that the council also hopes that you can firmly control the palace treasury. First, you are the commissioner. Second, you must know that the reason the Overwatch Council is able to maintain its current position among the 3 departments and 6 departments is inseparable from the palace treasury. Fan Xian asked, What do you mean by that? Chen Pingping glanced at him and slowly explained in a gloomy voice. The Overwatch Council has the power to supervise all officials, so it cannot have any relations with these departments. The affairs of the state and the council have always been separated. The Overwatch Council spends a large amount of money a year, but in all these years, not a single cent has been taken from the national treasury. So whether it is the Ministry of Revenue or the other departments, they cannot order the council around. This is the so-called independence. Fan Xian understood. The Overwatch Council's funds and salaries are all directly taken from the profits of the palace treasury. Correct. Chen Pingping continued. This was an iron rule set by your mother in order to separate the council from the officials of the world. So if you want to control the council in the future, you must plan for the thousands of officials in the council and the people on the periphery. The healthier the palace treasury, the more stable the Overwatch Council's economic foundation, and it can always maintain this independent position. Chen Pingping laughed coldly. Since the beginning of the bloodshed 13 years ago, the emperor has made who knows how many new policies. The old Ministry of Military Affairs was changed to the Council of Military Affairs, and now it is changed to the Bureau of Military Affairs. He has also re-established the Ministry of War. This is just a small example. These things in name, changed again and again, seem to have no impact on the bones. But in reality, they have kneaded these departments into a big pile of dough. And the reason the Overwatch Council has always been like it was before is because of the so-called independence. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. This is all because of the Emperor's words. So you must fight. Chen Pingping stared coldly into his eyes. If there is a day in the future when the palace wants to crush the Overwatch Council, you must fight. If the Overwatch Council also becomes a broken thing like the Supreme Court, then our Qing Kingdom, I'm afraid it will slowly become a broken thing like the Wei Kingdom. Fan Xian understood the old cripple's worries. He had seen more than him, and naturally understood the importance of the so-called independence of the Overwatch Council. So the Palace Treasury and the Overwatch Council have always been one and the same. Chen Pingping said each word clearly. Your father's thinking was really childish. To be in charge of the Palace Treasury, you must have power in your hands and firmly control this council. And to control this council, you must ensure the council's blood supply. Don't underestimate this thing called money. This small thing is enough to destroy the most tightly controlled organization in the world. Hearing him talk about his father, Fan Xian, as his son, could not say much. He could only silently accept the lesson. That day Fan Xian went to the first bureau and officially took up his post. The yamen of the first bureau was not in the square, gray-black building of the Overwatch Council. Instead, it was in a courtyard next to the Supreme Court in the east of the city. The door looked solemn, but the sign on the door almost made Fan Xian spit on the face of Tung Zijing, who was acting as a coachman. He leaned against the wall of the carriage and resisted the urge to laugh. He looked at the sign, which he thought was neither fish nor fowl. The first bureau of the Overwatch Council of the Qing Kingdom. Fan Xian suddenly felt as if time had reversed. He thought he had come to another time and space, to the door of a prosecutor's office in a city famous for its oil fields. The carriage was light, and Mu Tai had not been notified beforehand. The council's official documents had not yet been issued, so the Overwatch Council officials of the First Bureau did not know that a new leader would be arriving today. The gatekeeper looked at the carriage in front of the yamen and muttered to himself. The young man standing outside was holding his belly and laughing like an idiot. What a waste of that pretty face of his. He stood there for a long time and did not come in. What was he doing? At this time, Fan Xian had already led Deng Ziyue and a few of his trusted aides inside. Tung Zijing did not want to go in. From the bottom of his heart, he wanted to stay away from the Overwatch Council. The gatekeeper was an old man nearly 50 years old. He hurried out and stopped them. Sirs, what can I do for you? Fan Xian was slightly surprised. The first time he had rushed into the Overwatch Council, no one had stopped him. That was because no one else was going to wander into the Overwatch Council later. His mind worked quickly. Seeing the gatekeeper come to stop him, he wondered if the First Bureau had a lot of officials visiting them on a regular basis. Although he was not wearing his official robes today, Deng Ziyue and the others were still wearing the uniform of the Overwatch Council. So the gatekeeper did not know who they were, and his tone was relatively gentle. Fan Xian ignored him and walked straight in. Deng Ziyue held up his hand to stop the old man, and they walked straight into the yamen. Once inside, Fan Xian realized that the First Bureau was indeed different. Not only did no one come up to greet him, but after walking through a few rooms, he found that the rooms were empty. When it was time to be on duty, there was not a single person. He was a little confused. He found a chair in the side hall and sat down. He could faintly hear the sounds of chatter coming from the back of the yamen. There were a few officials in the Qinian unit. Coincidentally, one of them was with the commissioner today. His name was Su Wenmao. Seeing that Fan Xian did not look pleased, he hurried to the registration room to look for the official on duty. Unexpectedly, he could not find him. Su Wenmao was also puzzled. He had only left the First Bureau for a year. Why had the atmosphere in the yamen become so strange? Fortunately, he was an old man. Even if he could not find him, he could still find tea and hot water. He hurriedly and respectfully made a cup of tea and brought it to Fan Xian. Fan Xian was not in a hurry. He held the teacup in his hands and sipped it gently. Like the old officials in the court, He maintained his composure. Deng Ziyue glared at Su Wenmao. What he meant was, after all this time, no one had come out. Su Wenmao stood by Fan Xian's side, his body half-bent with a bitter smile on his face. He did not dare to respond. He truly did not think that the first bureau of the Overwatch Council would, under Director Chen's might, become like an idle yamen. The gatekeeper poked his head in from outside the door, and saw that these officials were only drinking tea. He guessed that they were waiting for someone, so he didn't bother to pay them any more attention. Thus, they sat awkwardly in the middle of the hall. Fan Xian was getting impatient. He stood up and motioned for them to sit, while he walked to the cupboard at the side of the hall. He began to flip through the files that had long been covered in dust. He thought to himself that no one had come to stop him. The discipline of the first bureau was truly broken. Suddenly a few people walked in, talking and laughing. Looking at their uniforms, they were all officials of the Overwatch Council. In their hands, they carried large bamboo baskets. In the baskets, there were fish chilled. They looked quite fresh. When these people passed by Fan Xian's group, they did not look them in the eye. Only one of them caught a glimpse of Su Wenmao and laughed loudly. "Old Su, how come you have time to come back today?" Su Wenmao's face was full of awkwardness. He saw Fan Xian's hand gesture in the corner, and could only smile. "Today, the commissioner is reporting to the council. We have nothing to do, so we brought you guys for a walk." On the way north, the Chinian unit knew of Fan Xian's methods. Under the pressure, they did not dare to say a word of warning. The man clapped his hands, and called for the others to bring in the basket of fish. With an envious expression he said to Su Wenmao, "Old Su, you have made a meteoric rise. If you follow that young master, won't you be able to do whatever you want in the future?" Su Wenmao considered his words and carefully replied, "The commissioner's demands are strict. I don't dare to use his name to mess around outside." The man laughed and said, "Let's not talk about that. In any case, these good things will not fall into the hands of the first bureau. Let's go." At the same time, he called out to Deng Ziyu's colleagues. "Since you're here, don't leave first. Everyone knows how long the meeting in the council will take. Come in with me to rub some." Deng Ziyu huffed coldly, and turned his face to the side. Seeing that he did not give him face, the man's face revealed an embarrassed expression. He thought hatefully, "Isn't it just holding on to Commissioner Fan's leg? What's there to be proud about?" He paid them no more attention. After chatting with Su Wenmao for a bit, he prepared to leave. Just then Fan Xian walked out. With a warm expression he asked, "Brother, earlier I saw you bring in a basket of fish. Are you going to eat this for lunch? I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you for a meal." The light in the yamen was dim, so the man did not see Fan Xian's face clearly. He only knew that he was a young man. He laughed and said, "Of course I can't bear to eat it. We'll give it home later." "Oh, looks like it's a valuable fish. Otherwise it wouldn't be packed in ice," Fan Xian said. "Of course." The man squinted at Deng Ziyu and showed a proud expression. Dreamy cloud fish shipped 800 li south. They were fished from a large lake. They're incredibly delicious. If they don't keep them chilled, they would have gone bad long ago. In Jingdo, even those high-ranking officials would find it difficult to eat them. Only the military has the ability. Fortunately, we are the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such good food. So it was sent by the military. Fan Xian smiled. He knew that the various departments in Jingdo would try their best to please the first bureau, but he didn't think they would put in so much effort. The man cupped his hands and said, "Let's not talk anymore. Since you are waiting for the commissioner's meeting to end, then please sit for a while. I'll go in and snatch my own fish, and then I'll come out to talk with you." Fan Xian said, "Don't panic. We still have something we need to see Master Mu about. It's just that we haven't been able to find him. I hope you can help us." The man looked at him and smiled. "I thought it was a big deal. I'll go inform him. You wait here." The man laughed and walked to the backyard. As soon as he left Fan Xian's line of sight, his expression changed. He jogged into a room at the back of the yamen and kicked the door open. Inside the room, there were a few people sitting at a table playing mahjong. Being disturbed like this, they jumped in fright and couldn't help but curse. "Mu Tai, who was sitting at the head of the table, had an unfriendly expression on his face. He turned a green mahjong tile into a hidden weapon and threw it at the man. "Are you going to a funeral? How can a few fish make you so hungry?" The man trembled. "Master Mu, a young man has come to the bureau." Mu Tai frowned and said proudly, "What kind of person is that? If it's someone we know, then bring him here. I don't want to give up such a good mahjong tile." "I don't know him." The man's voice trembled. "But Su Wenmao is with him. I think could it be that young master has come?" Mu Tai was shocked. He slammed the table and stood up. He pointed at the man's nose and scolded, You have to take responsibility for what you say." He was so frightened that he stood up and paced in circles. "Is it really the commissioner?" "I think so." The man's face was full of grievance. "In front of him, I didn't dare recognize him. I pretended I didn't know him and came to inform you. If it really is Commissioner Fan, you have to be careful." Mu Tai's face was full of panic. He quickly ordered his men to remove the mahjong table and rearrange it like an office. He jogged with the man to the front hall of the yamen. As he ran, he said, "Fenger, you have done well. Go back and ask your aunt to introduce you to a good marriage." "Damn, why did the commissioner suddenly come? Thank goodness you reacted so quickly. You are truly worthy of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council. You did not neglect your disguise work. Good, very good." The secret agent called Feng, or wiped the ice water on his hands on the back of his clothes and said, "It's Lord Mu's good leadership, good leadership." Chapter 265. Mu Tai's face darkened, and he slowly walked out of the hallway. Without even looking at the person sitting in the side hall, he coldly said, "Who is it that insists on seeing me? Don't you know that the first bureau is very busy?" Su Wenmao saw that his former colleagues were always looking out for him. His eyes darted around, and he gave Mu Tai a meaningful look. Mu Tai already knew who was coming, but he was just putting on an act. He pretended to be reminded by Su Wenmao, and suspiciously turned his head to look behind him. There he saw the young man. "You are?" Mu Tai frowned, and took a step closer. Suddenly, he turned pale with fright, and knelt down on one knee. "I am Mu Tai. Greetings, Commissioner." Fan Xian looked at him expressionlessly. He had no interest in playing along. Mu Tai's face was still full of shock, and he happily said, "Sir, why didn't you tell me you were coming to the first bureau? I made you wait outside. What should I do?" Fan Xian still did not speak, but a smile appeared on his lips. Mu Tai looked at this smile, and his heart began to grow cold. Everyone knew that every time Sir Fan Jr. smiled the sweetest, it was also when he was the angriest in his heart. Thus he could not help but lower his voice. Sir, Fan Xian still did not speak, and only smiled at him. Mu Tai's dark face showed a trace of regret. He did not dare to say anything more, and he knelt down again. In the side hall of the first bureau, the atmosphere was very oppressive. Fan Xian did not want to see him make a fool of himself again. After all, Mu Tai was the registrar of the first bureau. After Zhu Ji's suicide, he was basically in charge of the first bureau's affairs. He frowned and said, "The side hall is too dirty. It's not suitable for receiving guests." Mu Tai was stunned, and immediately became happy. He angrily yelled at Feng, "Get someone to clean it up. It's against the rules to leave the files in the hall like this." Fan Xian smiled. Mu Tai leaped high into the air and shouted for the officials of the first bureau to come out. They began to move the dusty files into the dark room behind them. These officials were all slacking off. They walked out weakly and saw Master Mu standing obediently next to a young man. They did not know Fan Xian, but they were all intelligence officers. Their brains worked very fast, and they immediately guessed the identity of this young man. Startled, they hurriedly went about their business. In a short while, the side hall had been swept clean, and the files were neatly organized. It looked like the first bureau of the Overwatch Council still retained their original ability to react quickly. "I'll give you an hour." Other than those who have council business in the various departments and manors today, and those whose identities cannot be revealed, I want to see all the employees of the first bureau. Fan Xian lifted the hem of his robe and sat down on a chair. He held out his hand, and Mutai placed the teacup in his hand. Dejectedly he said, "I'll go now." He knew that this young master was not easy to fool, and that his future was in Fan Xian's hands. All he could do was work seriously, hoping to reduce Fan Xian's dislike of him. "You don't have to go yourself. It's such a small matter." Fan Xian took his hand back and took a sip of tea. He found that it was already cold, and he couldn't help but grin. Mutai quickly reached out his hand to change it. Fan Xian stared at him and placed the teacup on the clean table beside him. "Come with me. I have something to tell you." Mutai hurriedly ordered his subordinates to call back all of the First Bureau's employees, who were always out and about, while he himself followed Fan Xian to the backyard. Seeing Fan Xian step into the room he had just come out of, Mutai felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. Fan Xian frowned and looked at the jade mahjong tile under the threshold. This is the most powerful yamen in the Overwatch Council. Even their mahjong tiles are made of jade. Mutai was sweating profusely as he explained, "It's fake jade. I wouldn't dare lie to you. This is a new product made by the palace treasury 2 years ago. It looks like jade, but it won't break." Back then, one of the 8 bureaus was given a set. The first bureau set has always been in the yamen, and no one has dared to take it home. Normally, when there isn't much work to do, we play with it occasionally. I am ashamed. I hope you will punish me severely. Fan Xian shook his head. "We'll talk about that later. I'm just a little disappointed that the first bureau of the Overwatch Council is so bad at hiding their tracks. Did you play mahjong here earlier? If you've already taken it, why is there another tile under the threshold?" Mutai wiped the sweat from his forehead. He knew that this was the tile he had used to hit his nephew. When his subordinates were cleaning up the room, they must have forgotten about it. Fan Xian sat down and looked at him. "Tell me, how did you become an official? It's not a big crime to play mahjong when you have nothing better to do." Mutai's heart skipped a beat. So none of this was a big crime. Just as he was feeling at ease, he suddenly heard a loud bang. He was frightened, and he looked at Commissioner Fan with a timid expression. Fan Xian slammed his palm heavily on the table. With his current strength, it would have been easy for him to smash the wooden table into pieces. But this time, he only made a loud noise. In a cold voice he scolded, "When I saw that basket of fish earlier, I realized that you dared to take bribes from the various bureaus. Do you want to die? If the council finds out, I'm afraid the Internal Affairs Bureau will be the first to skin you." Mutai hurriedly knelt in front of him. He mumbled for a long time, unable to say anything. He thought that a basket of fish was not a big deal. Fan Xian coldly scolded him. "Do you think a basket of fish is not a big deal? But you must know the iron rules of the council, especially when it comes to supervising the officials in the capital. If you play with those officials like brothers, how will you supervise them in the future?" Fan Xian had always seemed like a gentle person, but gentle people could occasionally get angry. His words were cold and oppressive, and it made Mutai feel terrified. Fan Xian looked at the official kneeling in front of him. He couldn't help but feel disappointed and surprised, not only because of the first bureau he was about to take over, but also because of the man in front of him. Rise. According to the council's rules, there was no need to be so strict between superiors and subordinates. But Mutai knew that he had to maintain a proper attitude. After all, he had some history with Fan Xian. Hearing Fan Xian's words, he dared to stand up. Fan Xian looked at Mutai's impressive face. His lips were like thin iron, and his complexion was dark. He couldn't help but frown. "In the entire capital, you are the first person to know my true identity." Mutai's heart sank. Last year, when he was investigating Milan Street, he had taken the liberty of going to Fan Manor to ask questions. At that time, the Fan household was not as popular as it was now, but this young man in front of him had revealed his identity, and he knew that he was the legendary commissioner of the council. This had been a rare opportunity. He had thought that he would have to struggle for many years, but in the end, it had all gone to Wang Qinyan's old man. "In this year, you have helped me with some things," Fan Xian said, squinting. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and said, "Logically speaking, you should have used my connections more often, but you didn't. This made me very happy. I thought you were a sincere person. I just didn't expect that in a year, you would change so much. You went from an honest person who felt awkward, even when flattering Sima Qian, to the wily old bureaucrat, who only knows how to muddle through life, and learn to change faces. I am very disappointed. The words very disappointed made Mu Tai feel even more disappointed in himself. He knew that although he was not as close as Wang Qinian and Commissioner Fan, and he did not expect to be in charge of such a large area by himself, in the past year, he had been promoted from a 7th-ranked official to a 5th-ranked official. Even if he thought with his butt, he knew that this was all because of Commissioner Fan. He took a deep breath, and did not try to explain himself. He only said in a low voice, "Sir, please watch my performance in the future." Fan Xian noticed that Mu Tai had changed from a lowly official to a lowly official, and he straightened his back a little. There was a hint of admiration in his eyes. He said, "That's good. Not everyone has the talent to be a supporting character. Don't always remember Wang Qinian's style. You should return to being the person who was wholeheartedly investigating the case, and I will naturally not hinder your future." After the storm came the sunny weather, and after the sunny weather came the storm again. Mu Tai looked at the commissioner in front of him, thinking that this man's mind was really like the summer that had just passed in the capital. He heard Fan Xian ask in a low voice, "Tell me, how did this place become so rotten? I've been to the other places in the council, and they can't compare. The officials in the other places are all cautious and conscientious. Not to mention playing mahjong. Even going out to pay their respects has to be rushed, and there's no wind. Look at this place. What's the difference between this and a wet market?" Mu Tai had already thrown caution to the wind. He wanted to be himself again, and he wanted to cling to Sir Fan Jr.'s thick thighs. He did not hide anything, and directly said, "Sir, I cannot escape the blame for the first bureau becoming like this. But for the past year, there has been no official to manage it, and the people below me do not accept me, so naturally they have become lax." Fan Xian was very clear on this matter. Back then, the head of the first bureau, Zhu Ge, secretly relied on Xinjiang and leaked information about Yan Bingyan, which led to Yan Bingyun's arrest in the north. Later, the council investigated and Zhu Ge failed. He committed suicide in a secret room during the council's joint conference. This was one of the most sensational events since the founding of the Overwatch Council. Since that day, the first bureau had been without a head. One reason was that Chen Pingping wanted to wait for Yan Bingyan to return, and the other was that the position was very sensitive. Secretly monitoring all the officials in the capital. If this kind of power was used, it could bring many benefits. At the time, the council did not have a suitable candidate, so it had been delayed. Even if there was no official to manage it, the rules and regulations have always been there. Why is no one doing anything? Has the council never reprimanded you? Fan Xian asked, somewhat puzzled. Mu Tai also didn't understand. He shook his head and continued. "Sir, you said that the rules are there. But if we want the first bureau to do something, the council has to issue an order. Without a head to speak, we ordinary officials can't find our own excuses, so we go to the manners of the vice ministers and scholars." Fan Xian was startled. He said angrily, "Did the second bureau not send any intelligence over this past year?" "They did." Mu Tai looked at him. "But according to the laws of the Qing Kingdom, we have no right to investigate officials above the 3rd level. We have to ask for an edict, or at least get the approval of the director." Fan Xian said helplessly, "You can't touch anyone above the 3rd level for now. What about those below the 3rd level?" Mu Tai replied, "Sir, I dare not hide this from you. Although the first bureau is the most important department in the council in name, in reality, it has always been the most incompetent department. The reason is very simple. The 2nd and 3rd bureaus only deal with intelligence, poisons, weapons, and such inanimate objects. The 5th and 6th bureaus are responsible for security, the 7th bureaus deal with criminals, and the 8th bureaus deal with books. Of the 8 bureaus, only the 1st bureau and the 4th bureau deal with people, and the 4th bureau's energy is mainly focused on foreign countries and the provinces. Who would dare to compete with the people of the 4th bureau? They could just find a random excuse to remove the county magistrates. Who would dare to say anything? At this point, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. We, the First Bureau, are deep in the capital. We look impressive, but in reality, the people we deal with are the officials of the court and the local officials of the capital. In terms of status, they are more respected than we are. In terms of status, the officials of the capital see the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council, so it's natural for them to be friendly to us. If the 6 bureaus have something to gain, they won't forget about us. But if they really want to compete, they won't be afraid of us. Fan Xian thought this wasn't right. Where in his previous life had he heard of such a cowardly brocade guard? For those below the 3rd level, you have the right to file a case and conduct independent investigations. If they are afraid of you, they will try to please you. Why would they dare compete with you? Mu Tai laughed at himself. Sir, those officials may be below the 3rd level, but what about their teachers? These officials have long ago woven a big net all over the capital. Some cases, even if we find evidence, can't be reported. Fan Xian squinted and asked, why? It's simple. The brothers of the First Bureau also have to live in the capital. Mu Tai sighed. Although the salary is much higher than that of ordinary officials, the relatives of the family still have to find a way to make a living. They find jobs in the various yamen. Even if you don't deal with these officials, even if you sell vegetables, if you investigate a scribe in the capital government, the capital's magistrate will have the ability to shut down your vegetable stand. The reason he uses is very much in line with the laws of the Qing kingdom. You can't find any fault with it. As for those who are connected to the palace, they won't even look at us. Like Dai Zhen of the Vegetable Inspection Bureau in Dangshi. He is a well-known corrupt official, but we can't touch him. Why? Because Eunuch Dai of the palace is his uncle. Ever since Master Zhu committed suicide to escape punishment, the First Bureau has no one to lead them. The officials under him won't easily offend the officials in the capital. Who doesn't have relatives? We're all in the bureaucracy, so we have to leave some room to meet in the future. Mu Tai said with shame, I'm not afraid of your anger, sir. This year, I've been trying to protect myself. Other than the big cases handed down by the council, I haven't investigated anything else. Sir, it's not that I don't have the guts. It's just that living in the capital is not easy. There are too many officials that I have to deal with. Fan Xian didn't say anything. He calmly said, from now on, talk to me like this. Rectification. The first thing to be rectified is that people don't do practical things. They only know how to please their superiors. Hearing the term rectification was new to Mu Tai. He felt an inexplicable sense of fear. He quickly asked Fan Xian for instructions. After a while, Fan Xian spoke expressionlessly. Mu Tai listened with a look of admiration. He was afraid that he would forget, so he ground the ink and scribbled. After some time, Deng Ziyu finally knocked on the door and reported, Sir, everyone is here. In the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council, other than the people who had stayed behind to guard the capital, there were 310 members in total. Other than those who were investigating the case and the spies buried in the manners of the officials, everyone who could come was basically all present. They took up an entire piece of flat ground in the back courtyard. Everyone had already tidied up their clothes and stood solemnly, waiting for the commissioner to speak to them. Fan Xian sat in a chair in front of everyone. He had no intention of standing up. He looked at these people and nodded slightly. He realized that a year of laxity had not completely worn away the solemn atmosphere around these people. He could still smell a trace of the gloominess of the Overwatch Council's spies. He was quite satisfied with this. Mu Tai leaned forward and whispered in his ear, The First Bureau is a bit special. The spies here are not secret. Everyone here has revealed their identities. Most of them are still in hiding. The spies' names are kept in the yard and cannot be accessed. If you want to see them, you will need the First Bureau's report and the director's warrant. He thought of Fan Xian's status and paused. You are the commissioner, so you do not need the director's warrant. But you will need the First Bureau's report. I will write it in a bit. Fan Xian shook his head. After a moment of silence, he smiled. There is no need. From today onwards, I will be in charge of the First Bureau. If you want me to write a report, I will have someone write it. Mu Tai's body stiffened. He had thought that Fan Xian was only here for an inspection. He did not expect that he would be in charge of the first bureau. But when he thought of the fact that he could work with Fan Xian in the future, and that it would be easier to get close to him, a trace of joy appeared on his face. There was a long silence on the flat ground. Fan Xian did not say anything. The hundreds of members of the first bureau stood in the same posture, as if they were javelins. Although they were not soldiers, their uniform black was still very pleasing to the eye. It gave off the feeling of Scotland Yard on a rainy day. After a long time, Fan Xian stood up and quietly said, "I am Fan Xian. From today onwards, I will be your chief official." Most people had guessed who he was, but when they heard that the world-famous Sir Fan Jr. was coming to the first bureau as a chief official, they were slightly surprised. But more than that, they were happy. After Zhu Jiyi's death, not only did the first bureau find it difficult to carry out its work in the capital, they were even looked down upon by the council. Now, with Sir Fan Jr. taking the lead, who else in the other 7 bureaus would dare to make excuses? The various departments and yamens in the capital would probably offer even more benefits in secret. But what Fan Xian said next sent a chill down everyone's spine. "I know how you have spent the past year," Fan Xian said with a smile. "From today onwards, you can no longer live like this." After throwing out this simple conclusion, he sat back in his chair and glanced at Mu Tai. Mu Tai stood up and coughed twice. He looked at his subordinates in a very dignified manner and said, "Today, I have gathered everyone here mainly because the commissioner has some things to say at the beginning of his term. I have been entrusted by the commissioner to say a few words. The main idea was decided by the commissioner. Please listen carefully, my colleagues." The officials in the council listened attentively. "Today, I would like to talk about the style of the first bureau." Mu Tai furrowed his brows and said bitterly, "Why is there an Overwatch Council? Why do we have the first bureau? Because there are corrupt officials in the court who lie to His Majesty, oppress the people, and violate the laws of the Qing Kingdom. His Majesty wants to supervise the government. The people want to live and work in peace, and the dignity of the Qing Kingdom's laws must be upheld. So there must be a bureau." The officials were stunned. Sir Mu had always been good at handling cases. When did he learn to write such articles about officialdom? But with His Majesty, the people, and the Qing Kingdom's laws weighing down on them, no one dared to say anything. "We are the first bureau. We are His Majesty's eyes and ears. If we want to be able to hear and see well, and share His Majesty's burden, we must be in sync. Our troops must be strong, and our orders must be carried out like a mountain. Otherwise, the supervision of the officials in the capital would be like a castle in the air. What are the problems in the first bureau today? His Majesty's instructions are wise and correct, and the first bureau's work has been fruitful. In this regard, the commissioner has praised us greatly." Mu Tai's tone suddenly changed and he said coldly, "But, in the past year, there have been many problems in the first bureau. As the acting supervisor, I am responsible. Tomorrow, I will ask for punishment. But from today onwards, you are not allowed to do anything that violates the rules of the Overwatch Council. You are not allowed to privately or in the name of the first bureau to accept gifts and benefits that can be converted into money from other departments of the court. You are not allowed to refuse any reports for any reason. You are not allowed to have daily contact with officials of any departments under any name. If a case requires a banquet, you must report in advance, and the minimum number of guests must be at least 3. Increase the organization of the routine work and strengthen. Strictly implement the rules of the Overwatch Council and the relevant rules. In the past year, if you have done anything inappropriate, please report to me within 10 days, and I will forgive you." Mu Tai was still talking incessantly, but the officials of the first bureau grew nervous. They did not know that this was the so-called rectification movement, but they could tell that if Commissioner Fan really did go all out, they would never be able to get the benefits they had earned this year again. Furthermore, they would have to throw themselves back into the dangerous and glorious work of offending the officials of the capital. Everyone could not help but look embarrassed and resentful. Even so, they still did not whisper or retort. They did not behave like the officials of the 6 ministries. Although their expressions fluctuated, they still stood firmly with great control. The Overwatch Council, which Chun Pingping had single-handedly trained, was, in terms of foundation and essence, the most solid spy team in the world. Mutai finished speaking. Fan Xian stood up and put his hands behind his back. He smiled and said, "If you have any opinions, say them now." The crowd was silent. The difference between the status of the ordinary secret agents and investigators of the Overwatch Council and Fan Xian, who was favored by the heavens, was too great. No one dared to argue in front of him. Fan Xian smiled and tried to draw the snake out of its hole. "It's a collective brainstorming. The director has sent me to the first bureau, because he thinks highly of my colleagues. You all know that I am busy, and I can't be bothered to go to a normal yamen." After he said this, the officials in the court relaxed a little. It was rumored that Commissioner Fan hid a dagger behind his smile, but at this moment, they could not see it. He was of noble birth, and was a world-famous scholar. How could he be proficient in the dirty work of the Overwatch Council? They agreed for now, and would think about it later. They all bowed and said, "As you command, Commissioner Fan." Fan Xian frowned, a little dissatisfied. Mutai was close, and he could see the coldness in Fan Xian's eyes. He thought Fan Xian was dissatisfied that his subordinates did not appear to be loyal. Worried, he quickly gave Fenger, who was standing in the front row, a look. This person was his distant nephew, also surnamed Mu. Mu Fenger saw his uncle's look and thought he wanted him to stand up and object. But how could he dare say no to the commissioner? His heart was filled with fear, and his legs trembled. In the end, he remembered the kindness his uncle had shown him. He steeled his heart, gritted his teeth, and stood out of the line of soldiers. Without any hesitation, he saluted and said, "Commissioner, although the position of the First Bureau is to supervise the officials in the capital, it is difficult to avoid social interactions. Everyone has relatives, such as my brother-in-law, who is currently working in the Cavalry Bureau. If I do not interact with him on a daily basis, that is fine, but I am afraid that my fierce wife at home will not stop arguing." These words seemed mischievous, but no one dared to laugh. No one knew why Mu Fenger was so bold today. Fan Xian was happy, but his face was gloomy. In a cold voice, he scolded, "Do you think the rules of the council are a pile of dog shit that you can slap on your face however you want? The rules have long been made clear that relatives within 3 generations are not included after they have been registered. If you insist on saying this, is there something wrong? Mutai, drag your distant nephew away and serve him according to the rules." Mutai sighed and dragged his nephew away with a face full of resentment to be flogged. Fan Xian's cold gaze swept across the crowd. "Is there anything else you want to say?" Everyone knew he was using his official power to oppress people, but they did not expect there to be a stubborn person among the secret agents. They stood out and bowed in a low voice. "Commissioner, investigating cases is what we should do, but what if we are threatened by nobles? What if we encounter officials making things difficult at home? What if the eunuchs in the palace speak?" There was silence. What the First Bureau feared most when investigating cases was running into officials with connections to the palace. No matter how powerful the Overwatch Council was, they were still just thugs raised by the palace. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and said, "Say my name." These 5 words were loud and clear. "Whoever dares to make things difficult for you, regardless of whether they are officials or nobles, just say my name." In the present Jingdo, Fan Xian indeed had the confidence to say such words. Even if the people in the palace still showed a glimmer of pride in front of him, if it came down to it, probably none of the 3rd-level officials or nobles would dare to take the risk of offending Fan Xian and bully his subordinates. With the power of the Overwatch Council in his left hand and the wealth of the world in his right, who would want to offend Fan Xian? Fan Xian looked at the official who had stepped out and felt some admiration. After he had deliberately suppressed Mutai, the official still dared to stand out and speak. Thinking of this, he slowed down and said gently, "What other opinions do you have? Say them all. I will not punish you." The official actually had nothing more to say. He braced himself and said, I believe that it is only natural that individuals do not accept money, but it is fine to accept some in the name of the First Bureau. On one hand, it is better to have a good relationship with the 6 ministries. In the future, it will be easier to investigate cases. On the other hand, after the money is distributed, it can be considered a supplement. Fan Xian looked at the people in the council. He knew that these people also cared about the money. He couldn't help but laugh coldly. In terms of salary, you all receive 3 times more than the court officials of the same rank. Although you are not as rich as the court officials, this was the original intention of the council when it was founded. What is there to complain about? Su Wenmao, who had been standing behind him the entire time, boldly said, "The Overwatch Council has always suffered the backlash of the officials and the disdain of the people. The First Bureau is in a special situation, and the court is not willing to subsidize it so." Fan Xian shook his head and stopped him from speaking. He looked calmly at the Overwatch Council's secret agents and officials present. He waited until the atmosphere had been squeezed until it was incomparably silent. Only then did he say, word by word, "Don't ask what the court has done for you. Ask yourself what you have done for the court." Su Wenmao was stunned. After thinking about it for a while, he realized that there was a deeper meaning to it. He couldn't help but feel a sense of shame and admiration. Yes, when the officials of the First Bureau were planning for themselves, did they ever think about why the court had established the Overwatch Council? The official who had stepped out to speak was also stunned. After so many years of education and influence from the council, and Chun Pingping's admonition, it seemed that he had returned to the state of mind he had when he first stepped into the council. His heart warmed, he clenched his right fist and shouted, "Everything for the kingdom of Qing! Everything for the kingdom of Qing!" This was the motto that everyone present had to remember on their first day in the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian looked at the scene and smiled with relief. He clenched his right fist and said to himself, "Everything for life." Chapter 266. The sky was dark. All of Jingdo was enveloped in a gloomy and somber atmosphere. The refreshing autumn air had disappeared. The cold rain that had continued for 3 or 4 days not only washed away the dust in the roof tiles of the private residences, but also washed the stone pavement clean. At the same time, it also brought the first chill of autumn in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. Fan Xian rubbed his hands together and sat on the 2nd floor of Xinfeng restaurant. His gaze pierced through the layers of rain outside the window and looked at a yamen across the street. A little further in that direction was the yamen of the Supreme Court. Comparing the 2 yamens, the First Bureau appeared much quieter. However, the expressions of the Overwatch Council officials who went in and out were steady. They were no longer the same as before. The rectification had been going on for a few days. Of course, Fan Xian did not think that just shouting a few slogans and reiterating the rules would be enough to bring back the minds of all the officials. So the secret self-examination and investigation had continued. After ruthlessly removing some people from their positions, and at the same time, even more ruthlessly sending some officials to the 7th Bureau for trial, the atmosphere in the First Bureau finally changed. The yamen, which was as precise as a machine, finally began to operate effectively. Fan Xian was not used to sitting in the First Bureau, so he refused Mu Tai's offer of a room. Instead, he booked a quiet room facing the street on the 2nd floor of the famous Xinfeng restaurant. Every day, he would sit there and eat some snacks to kill time. At the same time, he could ensure that if something happened in the First Bureau, he would be able to react immediately. There was a steamer on the table in front of him. In the steamer about the size of 2 palms, there was a single steamed bun. From this, one could tell that this steamed bun had a thin skin and a large stuffing. It was indeed not small, and the white surface was filled with a delicious oil that was about to overflow, making one feel a little envious just by looking at it. He blew gently on the bun and used his chopsticks to unfold the longan, revealing the freshly oiled broth inside. Fan Xian took a tube of wheat straw and tilted his head. "Do you want some soup?" "Hot." Fan Xian smiled and used his chopsticks to open the eyes. He picked out the meat filling that had been soaked in the soup for a long time, and had already started to taste. Using a small plate, he placed it into the bowl of the person beside him and coaxed, "Dabao is the best. This soup is hot, but the meat is not. However, you still need to blow on it a bit." Dabao was very obedient. Puffing his cheeks, he blew at the meat in the bowl with all his might. Tiger! 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 Ever since his father-in-law had resigned and returned home, the Lin Manor had become deserted. When Fan Xian was in northern Qi, Dabao spent most of his time in the manor. After he came back, he didn't see Dabao for a few days. He couldn't help but feel suspicious. After asking Wan he found out that she thought he had just returned, so she sent Dabao back to the Lin mansion. Fan Xian was not happy to hear this. Although others would not dare to make things difficult for Lin Manor for his sake, the servants in Lin Manor were the most cunning characters. Right now, Lin Manor was only looked after by Wanner's distant relatives. How could he be at ease? Unfortunately, after he took over the first bureau, he had been busy for many days and did not have time to deal with this matter. Taking advantage of today's rain, and there was nothing to do in the capital, he called Deng Ziyu to bring Dabao out from the Lin mansion and sit with him in Xinfeng restaurant to taste the restaurant's most famous jitong buns. After a while, they would return to the mansion. "Stop boasting. You can eat now." Fan Xian chuckled and looked at his brother-in-law. For some reason Dabao, who had the intelligence of a child, was especially obedient to Fan Xian's words. He quickly lowered his head and swallowed the meat in one gulp. Seeing how anxious he was, Fan Xian didn't know if he tasted it or not. Seeing this scene, Fan Xian couldn't help but think of Zhu Beiji eating ginseng fruit. He couldn't help but laugh. Deng Ziyu sat at another table. Seeing this scene, he couldn't help but feel a little strange. The Qinian unit that followed Fan Xian had a total of 30 people. They were divided into 4 squads to protect him. After Deng Ziyu took over Wang Qinian's position, he followed Fan Xian closely. So, he knew what Fan Xian had been doing these past few days. He thought to himself that the commissioner he followed was really an enigmatic person. After rectifying the atmosphere of the first bureau, he didn't give any specific instructions for a long time. Instead, he just stayed in Xinfeng restaurant every day to eat good food and listen to folk songs. For someone of Fan Xian's status to be so attentive to his retarded brother-in-law, Deng Ziyu was a little surprised and a little impressed. The sound of footsteps came from downstairs. Deng Ziyu immediately woke up from his idle thoughts. His hand tightly gripped the padao at his waist. His eyes were like an eagle's staring at the stairs. The person who had come was Mu Tai. These days, he had been in charge of corrective work in the first bureau. He had to examine the subordinates who were suspicious, and at the same time, he had to maintain everyone's morale. He also had to deal with the task that Fan Xian had secretly given him. He was so busy that he didn't even have time to stroll around the building. His eyes were sunken, and there was an unhealthy gloominess on his dark face. Mu Tai took off the rain hat on his head, unbuttoned his raincoat, and threw it in the corner of the room. Knowing one's weaknesses and using one's strengths, Fan Xian used people in this way, and analyzed himself in this way. Thinking of that meticulous plan in Shangjing, northern Qi, he couldn't help but sigh. He began to think of Wang Qinian, who seemed funny, but had actually helped him come up with many ideas. Of course, the true mastermind of that plan was Yan Bingyan. Fan Xian had originally planned to tie him to his belt after he returned to the capital. Who would have thought that the council would send Yan Bingyan to the 4th Bureau and leave him in charge of the 1st Bureau? It was no easy task to squeeze Sir Yan Jr.'s intelligence and strategy from an official point of view. He glanced at Dabao and found that his brother-in-law was launching a final attack on a bowl of mixed paste noodles. He couldn't help but smile. Picking up the steamed bun skin that had lost its meat filling, he reached into Dabao's bowl and carelessly smeared some meat sauce on it. Then, he quickly stuffed it into his mouth and began to chew in large mouthfuls. Dabao was stunned. He realized that a hand had brushed past his bowl. It took him a while to react. He slowly raised his head to look at Fan Xian, who was full of pride. He shook his head with some bitterness, then lowered his head to eat the noodles. Outside Xinfeng restaurant, the rain continued to fall. The force of the rain was great. After it hit the ground, it bloomed into countless balls of mist, gradually blurring people's eyes and obscuring the buildings around the street. A chill followed the raindrops and landed in Jingdo. It blew against the group of people in front of Xinfeng restaurant's door, wanting to burrow into their necks and borrow their warmth. Fan Xian draped a windbreaker over Debao's body and carefully fastened the buckle around his neck. Only after confirming that the cold wind wouldn't enter did he relax and pat his shoulder. Xian has to do some things. Debao can go back to the manor and play with Wanner first, okay? Debao was chewing on an apple. He vaguely nodded his head and said, "My sister is too fierce. Fatty will play." Fan Xian understood what he meant and laughed out loud. He thought to himself, if all the officials, merchants, husbands, prostitutes, and poets all had a simple and peaceful heart like Debao, perhaps his own life would be much simpler and more relaxed. He carefully said a few words to Teng Zijing. The Fan Manor carriage took the young uncle back to the manor. Deng Ziyu glanced at Fan Xian and asked in a low voice, "Sir, where are we going at this time?" "To Yin Manor." Chapter 267. Deng Ziyu was slightly startled. He thought to himself, on this rainy day, instead of waiting in the bureau for his subordinates to show their filial respect, instead of eating heartily in Xinfeng restaurant, instead of going back to his manor to enjoy the warm tea, he insisted on going to Yin Manor in the face of the storm. He didn't know what he was thinking. "I'll go get a carriage," he said to Fan Xian in a low voice, and prepared to walk to the opposite side of the street. Fan Xian shook his head and flipped his hand to cover his head with the hood of the raincoat. He was not afraid of the pouring rain outside. Just like this, he walked into the rain on Chong Street, allowing the rain to hit the gray-black clothes on his body. The Overwatch Council's official robes were very common, but there were special styles. For example, when investigating a case on a rainy day, they would often wear this kind of raincoat. The sleeves were wide but not long, and it was all made of waterproof material. There was a one-piece hat on the back. The style was a bit strange. It was like a windbreaker, but also like a cloak. When the rain fell from the sky and landed on this clothing, it would slide down smoothly. Back then, when Shu the scholar first saw this kind of Overwatch Council clothing in Jingdo, he was greatly interested and gave it another name: lotus clothes, using the meaning of rainwater sliding off lotus leaves like pearls. But after all, the style of this kind of raincoat was a bit strange, and did not fit in with the current sense of beauty. So, even with such a wonderful name as lotus clothes, it still did not spread among the people. Only the officials and spies of the Overwatch Council would wear this kind of clothing. So, in the current rainy days in Jingdo, as long as one saw this kind of person wearing a black and gray lotus clothes, everyone would know that the Overwatch Council had come out to do business and would hide like a ghost. Fan Xian walked first into the rain. The people of the Qinian unit did not dare to be negligent. Just like that moonlit night, they split into a few positions and surrounded him at a distance that was neither too far nor too close. They walked forward on the quiet rainy Chong Street. The rain pounded against their clothes, and their long boots stepped on the puddles. Tap, 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 tap. The few people in the mist unexpectedly had a silent and fierce aura. The owner of Xinfeng restaurant, who was bowing to send off the guests, raised his head slightly and looked at this scene. He thought to himself that this Commissioner Fan was truly an interesting person. Bringing along a few subordinates, he was able to wear these strange clothes beautifully and walk out with texture. The Yin Manor was not far. After walking for a while in the rain, they turned into a small alley. Once they came out and stood to the right, they could see the manor door, which was not very wide. Thinking of the father and son in this manor, who were in charge of all of the court's spy activities, even Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a glimmer of seriousness. Yin Ruahai was an old official who had been in charge of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council for 10 years. He was deeply favored by the emperor, as well as held in high regard by Chen Pingping. Even the 6 ministers of the court did not dare to be too arrogant in front of him. When the Overwatch Council was first set up, the official ranks were set very low. Later on, for the sake of convenience, The emperor basically used the method of bestowing titles to forcibly raise the political status of the Overwatch Council officials. For example, Yen Ruohai had become a second-rank viscount a few years ago. Last year, Yen Bingyan had been betrayed by the eldest princess to Northern Qi. In order to appease the loyal officials of the Overwatch Council, the emperor directly promoted Yen Ruohai's title to a third-rank count. Even Fan Xian's father Fan Jian, who was now the Minister of Revenue, was only a first-rank count. From this, one could see how well the emperor treated the officials of the Overwatch Council. However, there was no new plaque on the door of the Yin Manor. The small title below the Yin Manor still read Jingqingzi Manor, instead of Jingqingzi Manor. The words were also in black instead of gold, making it appear extremely low-key. But Fan Xian knew that other than the officials who had been granted titles, only the officials who had been personally appointed by the emperor had the right to write their titles in front of the manor. From this, it could be seen that the Yin Manor was also bestowed by the emperor. Even if they wanted to be low-key, they could not. Standing at the manor gate, where the rain had yet to stop, the caretaker at the gate had long since seen them arrive. Seeing the raincoats they were wearing, he knew they were officials of the Overwatch Council. But he didn't know if they were colleagues of the master or friends of the young master. He hurriedly descended the steps, using his hand to shield himself from the rain, and welcomed Fan Xian and the others. Fan Xian lifted the rain hat off his head, revealing his slightly wet hair. "Is little Yin home?" he asked. The caretaker was about to say that the master was not home, but hearing the other party speak, he realized they were looking for the young master. Looking at the handsome face, he had long since guessed who it was. He respectfully said, "The young master is home. May I ask if you are the commissioner?" Fan Xian nodded and took off his raincoat, placing it on his forearm. The caretaker hurriedly took it, holding up an oil paper umbrella in his left hand. "Sir, please come in." This was a clever man. He knew that the young master had returned from the north and had a close relationship with Commissioner Fan, so he took the liberty of not announcing his arrival and welcomed them directly. Fan Xian had the same idea. He smiled at the caretaker and very naturally walked into the manor. After all, his rank was above that of the Yin father and son, so there was no need to be polite under these circumstances. This was the first time he had come to Yin Manor, and he couldn't help but be curious about the environment of the manor. But following the caretaker's umbrella, he did not see anything out of the ordinary along the way. There was just enough rain to moisten the surprisingly large fake mountain in the courtyard, making the moss on it seem as if it had returned to its youthful green. Past the fake mountain was the inner courtyard of Yin Manor. Fan Xian looked at the two people in the distant veranda, listening to the rain, and smiled. He waved his hand to indicate that no one should follow him, and he slowly stepped on the puddles of water on the stone floor, trying not to make a single sound as he approached the veranda. The veranda was in the rain, and the stone steps beside the pillars were soaked. Even the ground under the veranda was half wet. But the two people in the veranda remained unmoved. They sat on two chairs and stared blankly at the scene of the autumn rain. One of them was Sir Yin Jr., who had just returned to the capital not long ago. The other was Lady Shun, who had fled thousands of li. The two of them sat on the chairs and did not speak, nor did they look at each other. They only cast their gazes into the rain, as if hoping that the ceaselessly falling rain would weave into a curtain of pearls and reflect their gazes back into each other's eyes. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He found that Yin Bingyun's face was still a sheet of frost, but there was a gentleness in his eyes. Lady Shun, who was beside him, seemed to have shaken off the misery of the day her family was ruined. There was a slight shyness on her face, but there was an additional trace of confusion in her eyes. But this pair of resentful lovers did not speak, did not look at each other, and acted as if the other did not exist. The scene was a little strange. What made Fan Xian feel even stranger was that Lady Shen was wearing the clothes of a servant girl. Her feet were shackled and dragged by a long chain. The end of the chain was inside the room. It looked like she had been chained up by Yin Bingyan. After watching quietly for a while, Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that Yin Bingyun's mood was not as relaxed as he appeared. Otherwise, he would have been able to stand behind the two of them for so long without noticing. So he coughed lightly. Yen Bingyan turned his head and saw that hateful, gentle, smiling face. Anger flared in his eyes. He didn't know if it was because he was angry at being disturbed, or because he wanted to make trouble for Fan Xian, because he had been forced to take a captive. Lady Shen saw Fan Xian, but she did not know what to feel. Her face darkened. She rose from the chair, bowed slightly, and entered the room. The clanking of the chains echoed endlessly in the rainy corridor. Yen Bingyan did not seem surprised that Fan Xian had barged into his manor. After inviting him to sit, there was no strange expression on his face. But Fan Xian was a little surprised at how quiet the Yen manor was. He sat in the chair that Lady Shen had left behind, feeling the lingering warmth of the seat. He couldn't help but feel his heart flutter. He forcibly suppressed his untimely and inappropriate thoughts and said, "I had thought that after you went through so much trouble to return to the capital, there would be many officials here to congratulate you. Who would have thought that on this rainy day, there would only be you and Lady Shen looking at each other and crying silently?" Yen Bingyan explained very seriously. "First of all, I did not look at her. I think she did not care to look at me. Second of all, it was the sky that was crying, not me." Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. Yen Bingyan continued, "Father has never liked to interact with officials of the court, and I am not as famous as the commissioner in the capital. Naturally, the manner would be a little quieter." Fan Xian shook his head. "I know that before you went to Northern Qi, you were a famous young master in the capital. Now that you have returned home, you will certainly be promoted again. How could those people who want to curry favor with the Yin manor not come knocking? Even if your family is the head of the Overwatch Council and does not belong to the same system as the court officials, I think no one would pass up such a great opportunity." Yen Bingyan's face was expressionless. "Father keeps 3 dogs. They are always tied outside the door, so no one dares to enter the manor." Fan Xian was surprised. He touched his slightly wet hair. "Why didn't I see them when I entered the manor?" Yen Bingyan said, "Today, there was a heavy rain that stopped the guests. Those big black dogs have been working hard these past few days. Let them rest." Fan Xian was speechless. "Sir, what business do you have with your visit today?" It was clear that Sir Yen wanted to deliberately keep his distance from this Sir Fan Jr. Presumably, this was a result of his family upbringing. Fan Xian ignored this. He took out the cylinder, opened it, and threw it into Yen Bingyan's lap. Yen Bingyan picked it up and squinted at it. His expression was a bit unnatural. "Sir, you really do trust your subordinates. But this is a way for the First Bureau to survive. Showing it to me is already against the rules." Fan Xian looked at him with a smile. "Don't think that you can avoid me every day, just because you are about to take over your father's position. You call me sir, so you know that even though I am in the First Bureau, and you are in the Fourth Bureau, I am still a commissioner. If you really push me too far, I will send out a warrant and have you transferred to the First Bureau. If I demote you, you won't be able to do anything about it. So don't talk so much nonsense. Helping me look at this information is the right thing to do." Yen Bingyan flew into a rage. "How can you drag people into your muddy waters? If you use your authority to pressure me again, I will go to the director and reason with him." Fan Xian waved his hand. Looking at the rain outside, he laughed. "Say whatever you want. If I do end up bringing you to the First Bureau to be a registrar, don't regret it." Yen Bingyan swallowed the anger in his chest. He pointed at the information and said in a cold voice, "What do you want to know? A big question." Fan Xian laughed lightly and stood up. He walked in front of Yen Bingyan and looked at his cold yet beautiful face. "I want you to find out for me if there is any connection between the second prince and the Chui family." There was a heavy silence in the corridor. There was no shock or fear on Yen Bingyan's face. He pointed at the cylinder and said, "Since we were in Shangjing, I knew you were going to deal with the Chui family. You did not hide this from me. But the second prince? There has never been any rumor that he has anything to do with Xinyang." He naturally knew that Fan Xian was dealing with the Chui family because of the eldest princess. He was investigating the relationship between the Chui family and the second prince because he wanted to deal with the eldest princess. So he was a bit confused as to why the second prince would be involved. Intuition, Fan Xian said calmly. I did not hide the matter of dealing with Xingyang from the beginning, because in this matter, there is a natural possibility that you and I will be allies. As for my suspicions of the second prince, it is because I discovered that in the half a year I was in northern Qi, he had been too quiet in the Qing kingdom. Furthermore, it was only recently that I gradually learned that this seemingly inconspicuous second prince actually has such great power in the court. There are so many officials who are close to him. The reason why Fan Xian thought that the second prince was unusually quiet was because, from the perspective of his previous life, in the struggle for imperial power, the crown prince, who had an innate advantage, could basically guarantee his future as long as he did nothing. And in this year, without the eldest princess' secret influence, the crown prince had indeed done so. However, the second prince was different. If he wanted to ascend to the throne in the future, he had to do something. A quiet dog might bite, but a quiet prince must not seize power from others. Yan Bingyan looked at him strangely. It seems that you have decided to get involved in the struggle between the princes after all. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. No, I am just making preparations in case they fight in the future, until I don't even have a house to live in. Yan Bingyan was silent for a while, as if he was calculating the consequences of this matter. After all, as an official, there was no one who did not care about the future direction of the court, especially young and promising officials like Fan Xian and Yan Bingyan. Sir, are you on the crown prince's side? Yan Bingyan suddenly raised his head and looked directly into Fan Xian's eyes, somewhat unreasonably. He asked such a seemingly stupid, overly direct question that left no room for discussion. Fan Xian was slightly startled, but a smile slowly appeared on his face. He shook his head. No. Yan Bingyan was silent for a moment, then gradually smiled. So you are on the emperor's side. Fan Xian did not say anything. He knew that Yan Bingyan would help him. Yan Bingyan had been locked up for a year, and had long been bored to death. Now that he had returned to the capital, he was still recuperating. If Fan Xian gave him such a fun and exciting thing to do, he was not afraid that he would not take the bait. Yan Bingyan lowered his head and carefully looked through the file again. He shook his head. Although the first bureau's investigation of the capital is not as good as it was before, it is still not bad. But for something as big as this, it is impossible to rely solely on the intelligence reports in the capital. Information needs to be cross-referenced, and this information is already a finished product. It is not very valuable. I know Mutai. He is very capable of handling a single case. But for a big situation like this, he has no control. If you trust me, I will take care of this matter. Trust? Fan Xian looked at his lowered head. He looked at the silver strands between the eyebrows of this young man, who was only a few years older than him. He narrowed his eyes and said, I trust you. Trust was a simple and purely subjective matter. How long will it take? Yan Bingyan raised his head. His voice was calm, but it was filled with confidence. I will return to the 4th Bureau next month. I will let you know before the end of the month. Fan Xian nodded. Is there anything I can help you with? Yan Bingyan shook his head. If this matter gets out of hand, I do not want to be a scapegoat. Don't worry. I love sheep. Fan Xian laughed. He was not only happy that the two of them seemed to have found the tacit understanding they had in Shangjing, northern Qi, and had begun to plan something together. He was even happier because he knew that if Yan Bingyan really began to investigate this matter, then in the future, Yan Bingyan could only follow Fan Xian. The relationship between the second prince and Xingyang had to be investigated, but it was more important to have Yan Bingyan join his team. Oh right. Yan Bingyan suddenly frowned. I want to ask for a soldier from you, Fan Xian asked curiously. You have been recuperating all this time. Are you secretly investigating something? As for asking for a soldier, Sir Yan has so many elite soldiers in the 4th Bureau. Do you really need to ask me? Outside the corridor, the rain was coming down even more heavily. The pitter-patter pattered against the stone floor, as if it wanted to create countless pockmarks. The trees in the courtyard, having drunk their fill of water, began to droop their leaves, afraid of the torrential rain. Yen Bingyun's brows flashed with a hint of melancholy and worry. There is a serial murder case in the south, spanning across several prefectures. Many people have died in the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice, but they have not been able to catch the murderer. Thus, the case has been transferred to the council by His Majesty. Fan Xian nodded. He was a knowledgeable man. He remembered that when the two of them were in Shangjing, northern Qi, they had received a secret report from the council, but at the time, they had not paid much attention to it. Yen Bingyun did not understand. This is within the jurisdiction of the Fourth Bureau. But after the Fourth Bureau took over, 13 secret agents died in succession, and not a single trace of the murderer was found. Furthermore, the way they died was extremely tragic. According to the report, the murderer was clearly a powerful martial cultivator, but there was no way to confirm what level he was. But seeing as he was able to kill so many investigating officers without a sound, I estimate that he was at least above the 9th level. Fan Xian began to take an interest in this matter. In today's world of peace, as long as a martial cultivator was above the 9th level, no matter what country he was in, he would be strongly recruited by the government. The court would do its best to welcome him, and even the military, for some reason, had changed its attitude in the past, and began to recruit such experts. But there were not many experts above the 9th level in the world. Dongyi was the richest in the world, and Sigajian had opened his sword hut to welcome guests. So they had the most experts above the 9th level. So, an expert above the 9th level could be like the Yi family, a member of the military force protecting the Qing kingdom, or like Friar He of northern Qi, a skilled assassin outside of the court. Even if he loved freedom, at the very least, he could go to Dongyi and occasionally help Dongyi's merchant groups as a powerful figure behind the scenes. In his spare time, he could go to Sigajian's sword hut to compare skills with other martial cultivators. These were all choices that were rich, noble, and had status in the Jianghu. Serial murder. Was he planning to rape or rob? A 9th-level expert definitely did not need to do these things. Perhaps he was a psychopathic killer. Fan Xian sighed. He just liked the thrill of killing. Yen Bingyun furrowed his brows, as if he had not thought that such a person existed in the world. Of course, he did not completely understand what Fan Xian meant by psychopathic. The Fourth Bureau has suffered too many losses, so the court needs to send powerful martial artists south to investigate. But as you know, there are not many experts above the 9th level. The ones in the capital are all above my father, so the Fourth Bureau cannot say anything, and His Majesty will not agree. So, I am preparing to borrow soldiers from you. Fan Xian asked curiously. There are no such experts in the First Bureau. Even the guards at home are at most 2 7th-level experts, and that is already very impressive. Yen Bingyun curled his lips and smiled. I want to borrow Gundam, and those 6 long knives under his command. Fan Xian looked at his scheming spirit, and wanted to slap him. In a cold and mocking voice he said, Us 2 brothers have the same wish. I also wanted to keep Gouda by my side. The first thing I did was ask the old man for it. And the result? He spread out his hands. Same as you. It was all wishful thinking. How could someone from the palace lend them to us so easily? That I don't care. Yen Bingyun smiled. In the future, if Gundam is transferred to your service, please lend it to the Fourth Bureau for a few days. Fan Xian was startled. Seeing the rare smile on Yen Bingyun's face, his heart thumped. He knew that the Yen family had other connections in the capital. Could it be that Yen Bingyun had heard something? Could it be that Gundam's 7 knives were going to be his? Thinking of this, he could not help but feel happy. Thank you for your auspicious words. If that day comes, I will lend them to you. Having finished talking about business, Fan Xian glanced at the quiet room and began to tease him. How have you been with Miss Shen? Yen Bingyun immediately turned into a block of ice at the mention of this. Sir, please conduct yourself with dignity, he said coldly. Dignity, my ass. Fan Xian scolded. You tied her up with an iron chain. That is asking her to conduct herself with dignity. But you are just like the assassins from the south I spoke of. Perverted. The rain continued to fall, and the atmosphere was not harmonious. Under the same roof, Fan Xian proudly bared his fangs and brandished his claws. Yan Bingyan was so angry that he could not speak. He could guess that the word perverted was not a good word. He was furious. Gritting his teeth, he slapped the chair in pain. If you had not left her in the diplomatic mission, would I have been tormented to the point of no return? Disguising her as a mate isn't a long-term solution. Besides, I don't think you need to chain her up. With you in this house, I don't think Miss Shin will be willing to go anywhere else. Fan Xian continued to provoke him with a smile. Then what can I do, sir? Yan Bingyan laughed coldly. That great princess of northern Qi is quite something. She has only been in the capital for a few days, and yet she can order the great prince to come to my manor and put pressure on me to treat Miss Shin well. She is Shun Zhong's daughter, a wanted criminal in the kingdom of Qi. Right now, I can neither kill her nor let her go. What can I do? The faint sound of weeping could be heard from the room. Fan Xian withdrew his gaze from the door. Only now did he realize that the great prince also knew of this matter. He frowned. If it is truly inconvenient, I will take Miss Shin back to my manor. Yan Bingyan suddenly raised his head. Fan Xian was strong and silent. After a long time, Yan Bingyan slowly nodded. After they left Yan Manor, they found that there was an additional carriage that had been transferred from Fan Manor. Fan Xian was no longer in the mood to take a walk in the rain. He sat in the carriage and turned his head to look at Miss Shun, whose face was full of fear. He smiled and comforted her. Don't worry, Miss Shun. Stay here for a few days. When things have calmed down, I will take you back to Yan Manor. He had investigated the matter of the second prince because of the death feud between him and the eldest princess. It was also because of some obscure reason that he would never say aloud. The matter was too big. If he did not have certain things in his hands, he would not dare to fully trust Yan Bingyan. Although trust was a matter of intuition and judgment, when it was not enough, it was more of a relationship of interest. The only thing that satisfied Fan Xian was that Miss Shun was in the manor, and he believed that Yan Bingyan would often come to the manor to talk to him. Yan Bingyan was deeply influenced by the culture of the Overwatch Council. Although he was secretly unhappy that Fan Xian had taken Lady Shin away, he did not feel too conflicted. After all, Lady Shin was a ticking time bomb to the Yin Manor. Although it had not exploded yet, it had already caused him and his son to quarrel endlessly every day. Now that Fan Xian had taken her back to the manor, on one hand, the two sides had reached an agreement to seek a balance of trust, and on the other hand, it was a temporary peace. Fan Xian looked out the window at the rainy street and sighed. He thought of a year ago, when he had also opened that chest on a rainy night. He thought of how crazy he had been that night, and then he thought of his own darkness and boredom. Only then did he realize that he had not yet had the time to change the world, but the world had already changed him deeply. As the carriage arrived at the entrance to Dengshi, the rain began to lessen. There were more people, and the carriage slowed down. It seemed to be a little crowded in front, and for a moment it could not move. At that moment on the long street, which could only accommodate 3 carriages side by side, a carriage overtook them from behind, joining the carriage of Fan Manor. A plump arm with a light yellow sleeve reached out and lifted the curtain of Fan Xian's carriage. Master, she called out in surprise. Fan Xian had been watching for a long time. He raised his hand to signal Deng Ziyu, who had already drawn his knife, to stop. He looked over in surprise. He was surprised that after half a year, the man still remembered his master. In the carriage, Yilinga opened her bright eyes wide and looked at Fan Xian and Lady Shun in shock. Covering her mouth, she said, "You are indeed worthy of being Linger's teacher. Which sister have you tricked?" Fan Xian scolded her unhappily. "You know I'm your master, but you don't know how to be respectful. You're about to become the second princess's wife. What are you doing out here in the rain?" Fan Xian had already begun to suspect the real role the second prince had played in the Newlan Street murder. The second prince had invited him to the banquet. Although it was later discovered that Sea Lily had sent the information to the eldest princess, and the scholar the eldest princess had planted in the prime minister's manor, had secretly conspired with Wan'er's second brother. Fan Xian had never let down his guard against the second prince. After returning from his summer vacation by the lake, he had coincidentally met the crown prince. Someone who was used to scheming against others could not be very honorable. Everyone thought that the eldest princess supported the Eastern Palace, including Fan Xian. He had not thought of this at first. But now that he thought about it, with the eldest princess's perverted desire for power, why would she support a legitimate crown prince? What was the point? When Fan Xian and Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongcheng, ate at Yisher Tavern, they unexpectedly discovered that Yisher Tavern's backer was the Cui family, and that the Cui family's backer was Xinyang. Although stringing together a few pearls could not prove anything, he firmly believed in his intuition. The second prince's silence was unusual, and he must have a powerful backer in the palace. And if the second prince really was in cahoots with the eldest princess, then Fan Xian could only say sorry. Although he had already begun to investigate the second prince, Fan Xian did not feel much resistance toward the girl in front of him, the girl who would become the second prince's wife next spring. He even hid the expression on his face very well. His first meeting with Yi Ling was not a pleasant one. Later, he used some petty tricks to fight the coffin breaker. But after their marriage, she often came to the manor to play with Wan'er. After a few interactions, Fan Xian began to admire this beautiful girl, whose eyes were as clear as jade. This was because she had a free and easy spirit that was different from that of the other daughters of noble families. But he couldn't stand Yi Linger calling him master in front of Wan'er and sister. She made him seem older than he was. In the carriage, Yi Linger said excitedly, "Teacher, why don't you come play with me when you're back? Teacher, where are you going? Teacher." Fan Xian rubbed his temples, listening to the string of words. He smiled bitterly inside. "Wukong, you're being naughty again." Chapter 268. Fan Xian had taught Yi Linger a few tricks by the lake. In reality, he had secretly learned the Yi family's coffin breaker technique. Yet, she had called her master from last year to today. This fact made him feel both funny and happy. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to your manor to see Wan'er," replied Yi Ling. After saying this, she looked at Miss Shun, who was standing next to him. She snorted and said nothing. What Fan Xian disliked the most was the sliver of arrogance in her bones, the way she judged others purely by her own judgment. He was silent and did not reply. He put on the airs of a master, but Yi Linger liked it. After a year together, she knew that Fan Xian was someone who cared about details. She smiled. "Don't be angry. I know you're a popular person in the Overwatch Council. Even if you wanted to keep a mistress in your house, you wouldn't have brought her to the streets." Fan Xian smiled and said nothing. At that moment, the crowd ahead seemed to have eased. The Yi family's carriage was the first to move forward, but it stopped there. It seemed that Yi Linger had found something interesting to watch. Fan Xian waved for the carriage to move forward. When they reached the Yi family carriage, he stepped down in his raincoat. Deng Ziyu and the other members of the Qinian unit quickly followed. In the carriage, Yi Linger saw them wearing the gray raincoat and walking in the rain. Only then did she realize that Fan Xian was not passing through Dingshiku. He had come specifically to do something. Dai Zhen of the Vegetable Inspection Department at Dingshiku had to wait for his subordinates to bring in the vegetables and fruits from outside the city. He would then classify them and sell them in different markets. At the same time, he had to deal with the daily meals of the internal court and the manners of the nobles. To be more accurate, he was the chef of the Qing Kingdom's nobles. However, the scope of his chores was rather broad. A stalk of celery was not worth much, but 100 stalks of celery were worth some money. A chicken was not worth much, but 100 chickens were enough to exchange for a good banquet at Yisher House. The Vegetable Inspection Department was not a yamen. It had no rank or rank. Because there were too many places to serve, there was not even a direct yamen. Perhaps it was because the officials felt that there was nothing to be gained from sending vegetables to the capital, so they did not pay much attention to it. In reality, Fan Xian knew that the appearance of this phenomenon had something to do with the new policies that were sometimes implemented and sometimes abandoned halfway. The emperor was playing around blindly, so the organization below was also very chaotic and redundant. As the chief officer of the produce inspection department, Daijun had been steadily earning money from eggs and vegetables all these years. He thought that he was the only one who knew how many benefits were hidden in these unremarkable things. He often hid in his bed in the middle of the night and laughed secretly. Even when his most beloved concubine urged him to go to his uncle every day to ask for a proper official position, he refused. Beautiful. I'm the first person in history to be able to sell vegetables to this extent. Daijun couldn't help praising himself in his heart. But today he could not be beautiful, nor could he smile. In this autumn rain, the officials of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council directly sealed his pitifully small yamen and blocked the accounts room of Datong Square. Datong Square was full of vegetable sellers, and a third of the capital's daily vegetables were supplied here. With an ashen face, he rushed to the accounts room and looked at the black-clothed ghosts inside. He patted his cheeks to make his smile seem gentler. So it's the officials of the First Bureau. I was just thinking that since it's late in the autumn, there are some rare fruits in the square. One day I'll have to go show my filial piety. The leader of the First Bureau's investigation today was Mu Feng. He knew that today's operation was a demonstration that Commissioner Fan wanted to make in the capital, so he did not dare to be careless. He looked at Daijun coldly and said, "Master Dai, come with us." The officials of the First Bureau had already sealed the account books with familiarity and began to use the names in the register to point out the people in the square and lock them into the carriages outside. The autumn rain was still falling, and Daijun's heart grew colder. He smiled apologetically and said, "I wouldn't dare to call myself master. Perhaps Master Mu has misunderstood something." He habitually stuffed a banknote into Mu Feng's sleeve. Mu Feng looked at him and felt pity for him. Had he not even heard of Commissioner Fan leading the First Bureau? Two indifferent Overwatch Council officials stepped forward and unceremoniously kicked Daijun in the back of his knees, knocking him to the ground. They took out a secret rope from behind their waists and tied a difficult-to-untie knot around Daijun's hands. Their movements were unusually clean and efficient. Presumably, the First Bureau had done this many times in the past. Daijun fell to the ground. His mind was in chaos. His wrists were in pain, and he was both embarrassed and angry. Finally, he couldn't help but curse. "What are you doing?" Mu Feng touched the instrument in his clothes and thought for a moment. He still did not take it out. "We are here to investigate a case. Master Dai, please cooperate." Daijun panicked. He rolled his eyes and yelled, "Help! The Overwatch Council is murdering for money." When the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council charged into the Produce Inspection Department, the people of Qing, who loved to watch a good show, had already surrounded them. However, they feared the thick black of the Overwatch Council, so the people did not dare get too close. Seeing the usually arrogant Master Dai in such a wretched state, they felt anxious. The thugs that Daijun had secretly kept took advantage of the commotion and blocked the path of the Overwatch Council. Daijun's hands were tied, but his mind was moving quickly. He knew that when the Overwatch Council acted, there was no reason to hold back. He yelled with all his might, "The Overwatch Council is murdering for money." In reality, he was also panicking. At the moment, he could not think of anything. He could only blindly yell the words "murdering for money," hoping that his uncle in the palace would receive the news as soon as possible and think of a way to get him out before the Overwatch Council threw him into that terrifying prison. Seeing the excited crowd surround them, Mu Feng furrowed his brows. He took out a document from his clothes and read Daijun's crimes to the crowd. Most of the hard laborers and commoners in the capital deeply trusted the officials. After all, everyone knew that Daijun's hands and feet were not clean. But the crowd had surrounded them, and it was not easy to retreat. The First Bureau had very few people today, and they had to bring account books and related witnesses. It was inevitable that they would be in a difficult position. Seeing this, Mu Feng's heart was filled with anger. From a distance, he glanced outside the crowd of onlookers. Next to two carriages, there were a few unfamiliar colleagues of the Overwatch Council in raincoats surrounding Commissioner Fan. They were coldly watching through the rain. Mu Feng panicked and yelled, "Let's go!" Dai Zhen's hands were tied, but he knew that the Overwatch Council's hell was not a place an official could go. His face was red, and his voice was hoarse from crying. Like a child, he desperately sat on the ground and refused to go down. His confidants also surrounded them. Although they did not dare to make a move against the Overwatch Council, they forcefully prevented Mu Feng from capturing Fan Xian. In the rain, Fan Xian looked coldly at the scene up and down the stone steps not far away. In his heart, he thought that Mu Feng could not be put in an important position. Then he heard Yi Ling's curious voice from the carriage behind him. "Teacher, the way the Overwatch Council is doing things is a bit absurd. In broad daylight, you're pulling and pulling with a minor official. What a scandal. If the commoners see this, where will the court put its face?" Raindrops hit the brim of Fan Xian's hat, making it lower and covering half of his face. Officials don't want face, so the court doesn't have to give them face. He calmly said, "Ling, don't look at this minor official. In a year, he can take more than 5,000 liang of silver from the palace. As for the benefits he's taken from Datong Lane over the years, it's even more incalculable." Half of Yi Ling's body was leaning against the carriage window. The rain had soaked a lock of hair on her forehead, and her clear eyes were full of interest. Today, she had gone to Fan Manor to have fun. She hadn't expected to meet Fan Xian on the road, and she had followed him to watch the spectacle. Only now did she realize that such a minor official could take so much money. At this moment, Mu and his men had finally fought their way out of the produce inspectorate and arrived in front of Fan Xian. Dai Zhen had been dragged by them through the rain. It was a miserable sight. The thugs also surrounded them, but they seemed to be able to see the power and influence these two carriages represented, so they did not dare to act rashly. As for the commoners of the capital, they looked at Fan Xian and Deng Ziyu's attire, and seemed to be able to feel the coldness emanating from these people in raincoats, so they unconsciously retreated a little further away. Dai Zhen was truly a shrewish minor official. His official robes had long been soaked in dirty water, and his hair was scattered across his slightly round face. He looked battered and exhausted, but he still fiercely scolded, "You Overwatch Council people eat and drink from us. Haven't you taken enough? You want to take me back to torture me for money again?" When the ignorant commoners heard him say this, they couldn't help but look as if they had suddenly understood. Fan Xian slightly lowered his eyelids and looked at the official in front of him, who was sprawled in the rain and kicking his legs like a pig on the verge of death. He was not in a hurry to seal his mouth, because the Overwatch Council in the hearts of the world's people had long ago formed an incomparably dark image. Even if Dai Zhen cursed a few more times, it would not affect the overall situation. And today, he was only beating a small cat. The key was that he wanted to see how capable his subordinates were. Looking at Mu Feng, who was in front of him with a face full of guilt and a trace of anger, Fan Xian shook his head and asked, "Why didn't you choose to go to his house in the middle of the night and take him? Although it's raining today, you know that there are many people in Datong Square. It's easy for trouble to happen." Mu Feng was startled. In the new regulations, it was written very clearly that in the future, cases should be handled in the open as much as possible. That's why he had chosen to go to the Yamen to arrest people. He wanted to do it beautifully and make a name for himself. If it had been before, if the Overwatch Council really wanted to arrest an official, of course, it would have been in the middle of the night. They would have gone to his house and taken him away. How did this become his fault again? Fan Xian didn't wait for him to explain. Even if you wanted to come during the day, you could have sealed the account's room and left immediately. Given your methods, could you not have allowed Dai Zhen to return to the council quietly? What use are you keeping those methods? What crimes do you still have to recite? Do you think you're an official of the Supreme Court? Do I have to specially hire a scholar to follow you and proclaim the sacred religion? Hearing these sharp and piercing words, Mu Feng repeatedly complained. On one hand, Dai Zhen's backing was indeed strong enough. If he used his methods recklessly, he was afraid there would be trouble in the future. On the other hand, He was also worried that the commissioner was a great scholar and might not be able to see them do such shady work. Hearing Fan Xian's sarcasm, he realized that although the commissioner had the reputation of being an immortal poet, it seemed that he was not opposed to the Overwatch Council's shady methods. In fact, he seemed to be even more passionate about them than Mu Feng'er was. At this time, Daijun was still lying in the rain and crying. His muddy eyes saw who Mu Feng'er was reporting to. He knew it was someone from the Overwatch Council, and he couldn't help but feel afraid. He didn't recognize Fan Xian, but he recognized Yi Ling-er in the carriage behind him. Yi Ling-er was the only daughter of the capital's garrison. Ever since she was a child, she had liked to ride horses on the streets of the capital. There were not many people in the capital who didn't know her. Daijun immediately cried to the woman in the carriage, "Miss Yi, please help me." Yi Ling-er looked at Fan Xian's calm and somewhat strange expression. She didn't dare say anything. She pulled her head back. Daijun knew that day was over. He finally used his trump card. In a loud voice he shouted, "Do you know who my uncle is? How dare you arrest me? My uncle is..." "Oh." Seeing Fan Xian's look, Deng Ziyu knew that he didn't want to hear Eunuch Dai's name. He raised his knife and slapped it across Daijun's mouth. Only now did Mu Feng'er understand. With some shame, he took out a small wooden stick with two ends attached to a rope and roughly shoved it into Daijun's mouth. The wooden stick was very hard, and it broke the corners of Daijun's mouth. 2 streaks of blood flowed down. Naturally, he couldn't speak. The crowd around them cried out in alarm. Fan Xian turned a deaf ear to them. He only said to Mu Feng'er, "I don't care who his uncle is. I only care who your uncle is. Do your job well and don't embarrass Mu Tai." Mu Feng'er made a sound of shameful acknowledgement. He threw Daijun, whose face was covered in blood, back into the carriage. He turned around and led his subordinates to capture a few thugs hidden among the crowd. They didn't give them any chance to resist. They used the iron rods that were commonly used in the council and viciously smashed them to the ground. Seeing this, the crowd was fearful. They scattered in all directions, but they stopped at the corner of the street and looked back curiously. In the midst of the torrential rain, a few Overwatch Council spies in raincoats were waving sticks and beating the thugs on the ground with dark expressions. Perhaps it was because of the power of the Overwatch Council over the years, but the thugs didn't dare to fight back. The scene was bloody. Fan Xian looked at the crowd in the distance and shook his head imperceptibly. Surprisingly, he didn't return to his carriage. Instead, he lifted his hat and went straight into Yi Ling-er's carriage. Yi Ling-er was startled. How could a man like him get into her carriage? Fan Xian pretended not to realize this. He looked at Yi Ling-er's slightly wet hair and paused. He took out a handkerchief and handed it to her. Yi Ling-er took it and wiped her wet hair. Smelling the faint fragrance on the handkerchief, she thought it was Wan-er's. She smiled and began to ask what had happened earlier. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and told her what Daijun had done. Yi Ling-er asked curiously, "How could such a small matter be worthy of your personal attention?" Fan Xian laughed coldly. "The waters of the capital are deep. Don't think that Daijun is just an official in charge of selling vegetables. He's quite greedy. The reason he's so daring is because he has a good backer. His uncle is Eunuch Dai of the palace. I'm here today to keep watch. I'm afraid my subordinates will act too slowly and alarm Eunuch Dai. If I don't act, the First Bureau won't be able to do anything to the people in the palace." Yi Ling-er opened her bright eyes wide. "Father once said that matters in the palace are the most complicated. He told me and my brother to stay out of it. Master, you're quite daring." "He's just a eunuch." Fan Xian laughed. "Eunuchs have no human rights," he thought. Yi Ling-er shook her head disapprovingly. "Don't underestimate the eunuchs in the palace. They have their own masters. If you embarrass them, you'll be disrespecting the concubines in the palace." Fan Xian was slightly taken aback. It seemed that he had only just thought of this problem. After a moment, his face returned to a sunny smile. "What's there to be afraid of? I don't like one or going to the palace as a lobbyist. If the concubines make trouble for me, as a fake son-in-law, the worst that can happen is that I'll be punished by the palace." Yi Ling-er tilted her head slightly. She looked at this fearless fellow and it was impossible to tell what she was thinking. The carriage arrived at the main gate of Fan Manor, and the two of them got off. Tung Zijing was already waiting outside. Fan Xian told him to have his wife take care of Miss Shun in a house in the back street. And then he led Yi Ling-er into the manor. He didn't forget to ask for the handkerchief in Yi Ling-er's hand. The handkerchief had been stolen from Haitang, and Fan Xian couldn't bear to give it away. Eunuch Dai was Consort Shu's favorite in the palace, and Yi Ling-er was about to become the second imperial concubine. This meant that Consort Shu was Yi Ling-er's future mother-in-law, and Yi Ling-er was about to become Eunuch Dai's half-master. Fan Xian had chatted with Yi Ling-er earlier for the sake of this relationship. He couldn't bear to give her the handkerchief, but he had to use it wherever he could. The rain continued to fall in the capital all day, and at dusk it finally lessened. Eunuch Dai, who had received the news, rushed out of the palace, flustered and exasperated. He was a popular figure in the palace, and because Consort Shu's literary talent was exceptional, she often helped the emperor copy some speeches. Even as Consort Shu's personal attendant, he also had the task of delivering imperial edicts to various manors. For example, when Fan Xian had first received the title of functionary of Taichung Temple, it had been this Eunuch Dai who had delivered the edict. By delivering edicts to various manors, he had naturally received many benefits. Now that he had broken the rules and entered the palace, no one dared to say a word. Eunuch Dai stood at the entrance of the produce inspectorate, his face bright red. He looked at the mess inside, and heard the cries of pain coming from the people around him. He couldn't help but feel angry. Pointing at his nephew's subordinates, he yelled, "I told you a long time ago. You can ignore the other yamens in the capital, but the Overwatch Council must be fawned over." One of the men covered his swollen cheek and cried, "My ancestor, we've given them a lot of benefits. Today I even gave them a banknote, and the official of the First Bureau accepted it. Who would have thought that they would copy it without error?" Eunuch Dai's entire body shook with anger. In a sharp voice he yelled, "Who dared to not give me face? Which little bastard led the team? I'm going to find that black-faced Mutai. How dare he touch the Dai family seedling?" He was a palace eunuch, and the Overwatch Council had no control over him, so he had the right to say such things. In his anger, he took his sedan chair to the First Bureau to demand Dai Zhen's return. Although his nephew Dai Zhen was a good-for-nothing, he had still sent over a lot of silver every year. He couldn't just watch as the Overwatch Council tortured him until he was half dead. In the capital's bureaucracy, who didn't know that the Overwatch Council was a place like that? Even if you made it out alive, you'd probably be missing a few parts. The sedan chair arrived at the entrance of a yamen, but Eunuch Dai was suspicious. He first had his attendant go in and make some inquiries. Not long after, the attendant came out and whispered something in his ear. Eunuch Dai's face immediately changed. After lingering for a long time, he gritted his teeth and said, "Return to the palace." The injured thug saw that the old man's sedan chair was returning to the palace, and he panicked. Ignoring the fact that he was at the entrance of the First Bureau, he shouted, "Old master, you must uphold justice for us." Eunuch Dai was indeed a man born in Jiangxia. His experience of announcing imperial edicts had trained him to be a master of speech. He spat out a mouthful of phlegm and spat it right onto the man's face. In a trembling voice he cursed, "I'm Eunuch Dai, not justice." Having said this, he nestled back into the sedan chair, feeling very uneasy. His attendant had asked around earlier, and the person who was personally leading the team today was Sir Fan Jr. Eunuch Dai now remembered that the emperor had already given the First Bureau to Commissioner Fan. But why did this Sir Fan Jr. take a liking to his nephew? Eunuch Dai knew that even if his nephew was greedy, compared to the officials of the capital, he was still nothing but an ant. How could he have guessed that Fan Xian, who only wanted to train soldiers and open a business, would think of him? Thinking of the Fan family's overwhelming power, Eunuch Dai couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. Dai Zhen's thug watched the small sedan chair leave in a cloud of dust, and stupidly wiped the disgusting spittle from his face. He still didn't understand who Eunuch Dai was afraid of. A few days later, Eunuch Dai found an opportunity to bring up the matter in front of Lady Shu, hoping to get his nephew out of trouble, and also to get some information. Unexpectedly, Lady Shu had somehow found out about this beforehand, and knew exactly what his nephew Dai Zhen had done. Angry, she harshly chastised him. Only now did Eunuch Dai realize that Sir Fan Jr. had already used some means to cut off his escape route. In his shock and fear, he finally cast aside his old face, and humbly went to Iguipin's palace to curry favor. Only then did he use Lady Lu's connections to quietly hand over a thin silver note to Fan Manor. On the other side, Mu Feng, who was in charge of the case, was also scratching his head. He looked at Dai Zhen, who had not been transferred to the celestial prison, and felt a burst of anger in his heart. It was this scoundrel who had caused him to lose face in front of Commissioner Fan. But Commissioner Fan had ordered that this minor character should not be punished. Why? His hand touched the rich silver note that had just been issued to him, and he couldn't help but mutter to himself. Chapter 269. Fan Xian had ordered the first bureau to arrest Dai Zhen precisely because he had the head eunuch behind him. The officials in the capital discovered that even Eunuch Dai had succumbed, and they were naturally intimidated by the determination of the first bureau and Fan Xian's methods. The first bureau's work was carried out in the capital in an orderly and secretive manner. In accordance with the rules of previous years, they broke down doors in the dark and quietly escorted the officials back to the council. The sudden purge brought a chill to the capital. The officials in the capital thought that this great scholar was going to stir up a storm in the capital, just like the case in the spring. But gradually people discovered that this was not the case. The officials investigated in this storm were all of relatively low rank. There were no important figures in the various factions, and there were no major cases that involved a lot of people. The elders of the court and the subordinates of the various princes, for Fan Xian's sake, and having learned from Eunuch Dai's mistakes, did not react violently. As time passed, they discovered that this storm did not touch on the important parts of the bureaucracy, and that there were only a few minor incidents. The officials, who had been a little nervous, relaxed. They guessed that Fan Xian was just a new official, and was using these 3 fires to establish his authority. Although the fire was not large, there were still people who were worried about being caught up in it. So in the past few days, Lady Lu had become the busiest person in Fan Manor. Her pair of hands, which usually liked to hand out banknotes without the slightest bit of emotion, now began to collect the banknotes with great compassion. Naturally, these banknotes were all transferred to Fan Xian. Fan Xian distributed most of them to the bureau, and sent the rest to Yin Manor. From ancient times until now, from Fan Shen's world to Fan Xian's world, money had always been the ultimate tool to win over people's hearts and pacify them. So the employees of the first bureau of the Overwatch Council were much more motivated, and the officials who had succeeded in intimate contact with the wife of the minister also felt a lot more at ease. Those who gave money, those who received it, they all comforted themselves. The affairs were already on the right track, so Fan Xian did not go to Xinfeng restaurant today. Instead, he sat in his study and flipped through the files in his hands. The files had been compiled by Mu Tai. Although the writing was not exquisite, it was clear. After paying a large fine, Eunuch Dai's nephew was lucky enough to return unscathed from the Overwatch Council. Taking advantage of a loophole in Qing law, he was not moved to the Ministry of Justice or the Supreme Court. However, he could no longer be a minor official in the Produce Inspection Bureau. The other small cases were handled more gently. Logically speaking, since the Overwatch Council was investigating the Produce Inspection Bureau case, Dai Zhen would not only lose his official position, but he would also lose his head. But Fan Xian somewhat appreciated Eunuch Dai's knowledge and tactfulness. He had saved him some trouble in the future, and Yi Ling had silently entered the palace to speak up for him. She had also passed on concubine Shu's plea for leniency. This was a favor he had to sell. Shi Chanli looked at his young teacher across the desk and felt a little uneasy. After the spring examinations, his 3 good friends, Ho Jicheng, Yang Wanli and Cheng Shilin, had been sent out to become officials. According to the letters, They were doing well in various counties and provinces. Prime Minister Lin had been in the court for many years, so naturally he had connections all over the counties and provinces. These people all had their eyes on Fan Xian, and as for Fan Xian's 3 prize students, they naturally had to be taken care of. Of the 4, only Shi Chanli did not have a name on the list, so he could not immediately embark on an official career. Before Fan Xian left for Northern Qi, he left a letter for Shi Chanli to wait for his return. Unexpectedly, after Fan Xian returned, he immediately took over the affairs of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Shi Chanli was not sure what he could do to help his teacher. His friend had already become a ruler of a region, while he himself could only sit in his study and transcribe files. Even though he was an easygoing person, he could not help but feel sad. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at him. With a smile, he said, "Do you think it's too stuffy?" Shi Chanli smiled bitterly. "Teacher, you are a few years younger than me, and yet you can be so calm in the midst of complicated documents. It seems that I also need to sharpen my temperament." Fan Xian chuckled. If Ho Jicheng were here, he would certainly stand up and reply. If it was Yang Wanli, perhaps he would have already been unable to suppress his curiosity and begun to question why Fan Xian had released a felon. Only Shi Chanli was not impatient, nor did he have a dull tongue. It seemed that Fan Xian's decision to keep him by his side had not been a mistake. "Don't call me teacher," he said. "I'd rather you call me sir. It's not that it's too official, but it feels a little absurd." Shi Chanli was stunned. In fact, it was very common for examinees to be younger than the examiners. He did not feel that there was anything wrong with it. Fan Xian handed over the files on the table. "What do you think?" he asked. Shi Chanli did not know whether or not Fan Xian was testing him, but he had memorized these documents in the past 2 days. He shook his head and said sincerely, "I really do not understand, teacher, what you mean by this. If you really wanted to fight a tiger, you wouldn't have to keep an eye on these mice." Fan Xian smiled. "I just wanted to find something for the cats of the First Bureau to do, familiarize themselves with it, so that when we do something big in the future, they won't be so flustered." Shi Chanli pretended not to hear the word big, and sincerely asked for guidance. "Sir, as an official in the court, I naturally have to share His Majesty's worries and work for the court. But looking at your actions these past few days, although you have caught the small and the big, you have still offended some people. Offending people is a characteristic of the Overwatch Council," Fan Xian explained. "You also know that the Overwatch Council is His Majesty's private organization. It is not a true public tool, but His Majesty's private tool. We only have one person we are loyal to, so whether it is from the perspective of the palace or the Overwatch Council, we must play the role of offending people. And the First Bureau is deep in the capital. Being hindered by the prosperity of the capital, it has completely lost His Majesty's original intention. It is not valiant enough, not sinister enough. His Majesty put me in charge of the First Bureau, because he wants the First Bureau to return to its original role of offending people." Shi Chanli could no longer pretend. His teacher had already explained everything to him. He could only answer honestly. "His Majesty wants you to be a lonely official." Fan Xian nodded. "I am not biased. His Majesty wants me to be a second Shen Pingping, but..." His tone changed, and he said with a hint of mockery, "I went to visit the director's manor. The manor is extravagant and luxurious, but that loneliness is carved into the bones. I do not like it." Shi Chanli immediately understood what he meant. He said worriedly, "But if you feign civility, His Majesty's eyes are like torches. He can see clearly. I am afraid it will not be good for your future." Fan Xian smiled and did not say anything. He thought that under normal circumstances, the emperor would not have thoughts more poisonous than a tiger's. Shi Chanli understood that he had said too much, so he changed the subject. "The First Bureau is investigating now. Although they have reverted to their tradition of arresting people at night, the First Bureau has refused to cover up the news. If anyone asks, they will tell them the truth." "I do not agree." Fan Xian asked with interest, "Why?" Shi Chanli thought for a moment and said, "The Overwatch Council is His Majesty's secret organization. The reason it can intimidate the officials, other than the special privileges established by Qing law, is because of its sense of mystery and darkness. People are ignorant. The more they don't understand something, the more afraid they are. Now that you have purposely put the First Bureau's actions on the table, I am afraid it will weaken this feeling and cause the people of the court to look down on the Overwatch Council. In the days that he had been dealing with the First Bureau, Fan Xian had been thinking about the issue of Ruoro and Li Hongqing's marriage. This matter had nothing to do with the Crown Prince's character, or whether or not there was a conflict of political standpoints between the two. For Fan Xian, the most important thing was one thing. Did his sister like it? Ruoro had already made her stance clear. She didn't like it. Fan Xian, like all older brothers, was confused and angry at girls in their puberty. He thought to himself, are you not going to marry? But more than that, he wanted to protect her. Since his sister didn't like it, he had to break up the marriage. It was simple. This was no small matter. In fact, it could be said to be the most troublesome thing Fan Xian had encountered since coming to the capital from Danzhou. The emperor had appointed a marriage, and the two families were well matched. There was no reason to obstruct this marriage. So there were only two ways to proceed. First, keep an eye on the second prince, and be ready to destroy him at any moment, dragging Li Hongqing down. When that time came, he could ask to break off the marriage. Second, start with Ruoro. Give her a benefit that even the emperor could not ignore, and temporarily keep her away from the capital. The first method, who knew how much of a ruckus it would cause, and the second method was too vague. Even Fan Xian himself had no confidence in it. They say that a general's success is built on the bones of 10,000 people. Do I have to create a marriage to break the bones of 10,000 people? He laughed self-deprecatingly. If that didn't work out, he would have to trouble Uncle Wu Zhu to take Ruoro on a journey to the ends of the earth. Presumably, His Majesty would not actually execute the entire Fan family because of this. Chapter 270. Returning to the manor, Yilinger and Princess Rojia had already returned. Fan Xian returned to his room and called for Siki to pour tea. He sent away the serving girl, who, like Sisi, had been complaining about him in the autumn. Taking advantage of the fact that there was only him and his wife in the room, he quietly asked, "Has there been any news in the palace?" Lin Wanner was sitting by the window, embroidering something against the light outside. Hearing his question, she raised her head in surprise. What has happened? It was close to dusk, and the light from the sky shone in through the window. Fan Xian looked at Wanner's tightly furrowed brows, and his heart ached as he walked forward. He rubbed her smooth brows and said, "The light is not good. What are you embroidering?" Wanner's face was a bit pale. Perhaps it was because she had not slept well last night. She lowered her head and giggled. She hid what she was embroidering behind her back and said, "I'll show you when I'm done." Fan Xian looked at his wife's weak appearance and long eyelashes. He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of guilt. Ever since he had left Jingdo at the beginning of spring, his care for his wife had been weaker than it had been last year. This was not to say that he was someone who liked the new and hated the old. After all, the great Sir Fan Jr. did not even have a concubine. It was just that there were too many things holding him back, and he rarely paid attention to family matters. Lin Wanner thought of what he had asked earlier. She thought for a moment and then said, "The palace has been quiet recently. There is nothing special. Why would you ask this?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Your heartless uncle sent me to manage the First Bureau. I don't know how many officials I will offend. The true masters of those officials all live in the palace. Naturally, I have to pay more attention." Lin Wanner's identity was special. She had the royal grandmother's favor and the emperor's favor. Her position in the palace was even higher than Fan Xian had imagined. The emperor did not have a daughter. Presently, Qing Kingdom did not have a proper princess. Wanner was not much different from a princess. She thought for a moment and then smiled. "Don't worry. We all know the emperor favors you. Those ladies will only say good things about you in front of you." Fan Xian smiled and said, "I've only seen the emperor a few times. I don't know where the word favor comes from. If it's said that the emperor favors you, then it's possible. As for me, it's just love me, love my dog. A trace of adoration flashed through Lin Wanner's eyes. Husband is always like this. She continued. Shu Guifei has been full of praise for you these days. As for Yi Guipin, you also know that she is a relative of our family. No matter what, she has to side with you. It's just that the empress is as quiet and indifferent as usual. As for the other concubines, they don't even have the right to speak in the palace, so I haven't remembered them. Fan Xian trusted his wife's judgment. Even if he took over the Overwatch Council in the future, the royal palace was still a place that his fingers could not touch. And Wanner was his most reliable spy and spy. Lady Shu had said good things about him, because he had done her a favor. A few words didn't cost him much money. What did Lady Ning say? Fan Xian asked curiously. News of me and your great brother fighting over the road should have reached the palace a long time ago. Lin Wanner covered her mouth and laughed. Lady Ning can't be bothered with you. She has always loved me the most. She said that you and the great prince are two brats messing around. In the future, she will beat you 50 times. Fan Xian pretended to be alarmed. My wife. The beatings in the palace are not pleasant. You have to help me put in a few good words. Lin Wanner was too lazy to respond to his naughty joke. She spat and said, You like to offend people, and for no reason. You always want me to clean up after you. She took out the tight embroidery from behind her and giggled. You have nothing to ask, Commissioner? Then please leave. Don't disturb me. Fan Xian pulled back his hand that was about to grab her hand. I don't know what it is, he said gloomily. Just as he was about to leave, he remembered the important person he had forgotten. With a trace of hesitation he asked, Did you see the Empress Dowager? Lin Wanner's hand paused. A moment later, she raised her head. There was confusion and sadness in her eyes. She nodded. I saw her. Grandmother didn't say anything. The Empress Dowager, who had always lived deep in the palace, was in reality the true ruler of the entire palace. Strangely, Fan Xian had entered the palace a few times, but had never had the chance to see her. Even the last 2 times the couple had entered the palace, the Empress Dowager had said she was ill and refused to see her. And when Wanu entered the palace herself, the Empress Dowager loved her dearly. She held her in her arms and called her darling. The Empress Dowager was clearly distancing herself from Fan Xian. This made Wanner feel vaguely uneasy and confused. Fan Xian laughed coldly in his heart. He knew that the Empress Dowager had guessed something, but he was not afraid. Lin Wanner looked into his eyes and sighed. Today, she told me about Linger entering the palace last time. Husband, I know your official duties are a bit difficult, but you still don't know what kind of person you are. It looks like you are using her, but I'm afraid you are giving yourself an excuse to remember her favor. The things you told me last night are very scary. Second brother, although the second prince looks soft and easygoing right now, his personality is actually very twisted. Since you have no choice but to investigate him, if you still have so many misgivings like you do now, I'm afraid it is not appropriate. Fan Xian looked at his wife's worried face and smiled slightly. He nodded. I also didn't expect that when you were little, you would give the second prince the name Pebble. He looks easygoing, but once he sets his mind on something he will not change, Lin Wanner said worriedly. Fan Xian had always believed that the way of a husband and wife was based on sincerity. If he was reborn, he would have to be more cautious of the person who slept next to him. That kind of life would be a bit miserable. So he did not hide the fact that he was investigating the second prince from his wife. Hearing Wanner's worry, he comforted her. In reality, it is for the good of the second prince. Looking at the current situation, the court officials seem to be blinded by the emperor's determination to protect the crown prince. If no one pulls the second prince up now, when he truly climbs to the top, it will not be easy for him to come down again. Lin Wanner smiled sweetly and did not continue this topic. She changed the subject. I don't know how your heart was born, but it has a few more openings than other people. Your brain is full of twists and turns. A few more openings than a person? Fan Xian almost blurted it out, but he knew that he was just an actor. When it came to politics, he was very naive. The only thing he could rely on was his own cold-bloodedness and the gentleness on the surface. He bowed deeply to his wife and smiled. How could I be compared to the great strategist Lin? You are a fairy who escaped from the most scheming palace in the world. Lin Wanner spat at him and laughed. Do you really think the palace is so embarrassing? Fan Xian smiled. A wise man once said that in this world, there are only brothels and the palace. It is a world of darkness. It is not a place for people to stay. Hearing this, Lin Wanner was startled. She felt a bit displeased and lowered her head. Only now did Fan Xian remember that his wife also came from the palace. What he said really did not take her feelings into consideration. He smiled and apologized, and the two of them returned to normal. After a moment of silence, Lin Wanner thought about it carefully. Her heart was moved. Although her birth mother was the eldest princess, how many women in this world could receive such respectful treatment from their husbands after marriage? She had never heard of a husband apologizing to his wife. Lin Wanner said warmly, "The palace is indeed not what you think it is. Uncle the Emperor is a wise ruler who does not lust after women. The masters in the palace are all decent on the surface. No one dares to use the methods you talked about in the novels in the past. The Empress Dowager's eyes are watching. If anyone dares to spoil the blood of the Emperor, that ancestor will not tolerate it." Hearing this, Fan Xian's heart jumped. He felt even more at ease. Lin Wanner smiled. The Emperor is very strict within the palace. Fighting for favor? There is no favor to begin with, so how can they fight? The Empress does not care much, so those concubines can only put all their thoughts on the mahjong table. Fighting for favor is good. In reality, it is no different from the houses of other princes. Fan Xian was surprised. He had not thought that the palace would be so harmonious. Didn't that mean that the pile of palace grievances he had read in his previous life were useless? He scratched his head in self-mockery and laughed. No wonder you are so good at mahjong, Wanner. Even that little monster Fan Xia can only tie with you. As soon as she heard about mahjong, Lin Wanner's face shone with a strange light, which scared Fan Xian. He walked up to take a closer look, only to find that the light was hidden like flowing light, but it was contained within. It was like a piece of jade. It was called the light of a master who returned to simplicity. Lin Wanner's eyes wandered, and she glared at her indecent husband. My hands are itching to marry you, but you are so busy every day that I can't see you. But my luck is good. I managed to catch a genius at the mahjong table like my brother-in-law. She gritted her teeth, rolled her sleeves, and rubbed her fists. I don't know where Fan Xia has gone these days. Every day he can't catch anyone at the mahjong table. Playing mahjong with his mother is torturous. Look at how courteous she is. It's like I am her mother-in-law. Fan Xian scratched the bridge of her sharp little nose and jokingly scolded. Who talks like that? He paused and then said, Lady Lu is not your mother-in-law. Don't be too unreasonable in the manner. Lin Wanner was full of hidden bitterness. Am I that kind of person? Her tone changed. In a few days, it will be time to admire the chrysanthemums. According to the rules of the past, the nobles in the palace will all go to Shi Mountain. I don't know how they will arrange for us this year. We must go, but we have to see how we go. I reckon that in a few days, there will be eunuchs from the palace coming to deliver an edict. Don't forget about this. Admire the chrysanthemums? Fan Xian's brows twitched. He knew that in the crisp autumn air, the people of Jingdo all liked to go to the gardens to admire the chrysanthemums. He had not thought that the royal family would also have this hobby. Naturally, he had to go to the Li family's large gathering. However, thinking of what he had done recently in Jingdo, he suddenly wondered if the older generation of foxes were watching his every move like they were admiring the chrysanthemums. Not noticing her husband's sudden silence, Lin Wanner said seriously, I haven't been able to play mahjong lately, and the chrysanthemums haven't bloomed yet. I'm always bored. The book you promised me before marriage, when will you write it for me to read? Fan Xian's head was full of questions. How could he still have the energy to copy Dream of the Red Chamber? He forced a smile and begged for mercy. I say, grandmother, please spare me. Seeing Lin Wanner's stubborn expression of urging him to write, He didn't dare to stay in the room and dawdle. Smoke rose from his, but as he pushed open the door to hide, Fan Xian fled as if he had seen a ghost. He made his way through the wide courtyard, until he ran into a few servant girls who were covering their faces and laughing. Only then did he feel that something was wrong. He coughed twice, trying to show the demeanor of a famous person and a famous official. But his body had not even straightened for a moment, before he immediately slowed down. He gritted his teeth. Since he was young, he had decided that he wanted to live a beautiful life. Why should he care about how others looked at him? He grunted, hummed a little tune, and hopped into his study. Although his conversation with his wife was casual, he had obtained some useful information. However, Fan Xi's movements these days were indeed a little strange. Fan Xian frowned, faintly worried. Then he thought of the problem with Story of the Stone. Only then did he remember that the Emperor of Northern Qi had sealed off the news. He owed him a favor, and it seemed that he would have to copy a chapter and send it over. However, the fact that he was the author of Story of the Stone could not be hidden for long. He decided not to use the Overwatch Council's secret mail route. After sitting for a short while, before the light outside the room had completely dimmed, Yan Bingyan had arrived as promised. Fan Xian looked at the file he handed over, and could not help but rub his temples. Today, he had first gone through the file Mutai had handed over, and set the tone with Shi Chanli. Next, he had gone to the old manor to do some work. After returning to comfort his wife, he now had to talk to Sir Yan. In a short day he had done so many things. It seemed that the so-called cultivation of a powerful official was indeed a very tiring path. I've already arrested the people you wanted me to arrest. I don't know if this will be of any help to your work. Fan Xian did not look at the file. He only asked calmly. A while ago, the whack-a-mole seemed to have not touched upon the bureaucracy of the capital, but in reality, under the cover of a large number of redundant cases, he had carefully approached the secret power of the second prince. He had also tentatively arrested 2 officials, because Yan Bingyan believed that although the 2 officials were of low rank, they were important figures in investigating whether or not there was a relationship between the second prince and the eldest princess. Yan Bingyan sat in a chair, his expression calm. He pointed at the file in front of him. They have been arrested. Fan Xian was shocked. That fast. He was too lazy to look at the file again. The conclusion, he asked directly. Yan Bingyan said coldly. Every year, Xinjiang smuggles a large amount of goods to northern Qi and Dongyi. On the surface, the deficit is caused by the crown prince of the Eastern Palace. But in reality, the largest amount is given to the second prince through the Ming family. It is used to bribe the officials in the court and befriend the feudal officials of various places. So your judgment is correct. The second prince is backed by the eldest princess. Fan Xian frowned. The Ming family? The in-laws of the Cui family? Exactly. Such a large amount. How did they get it from the palace treasury to the second prince? Fan Xian asked. Of course, they couldn't go through the capital. They went around Jiangnan. In the middle, a few royal merchants split it up. From bottom to top, they were all controlled by the second prince. Yan Bingyan glanced at him. The process is complicated. It is written in the file. If there is anything you do not understand, you can just read it. It is more complicated to say it. Fan Xian did not pay attention to the doubt in his voice about his ability. He only sank into deep thought. His judgment was correct. He took a deep breath and said, "The man is very handsome." Fan Xian countered with a question. The eldest princess and the second prince did it so secretly, but we easily found out. Do you think the palace doesn't know? How could our director Chen not know? Even if the palace is vigilant, they certainly do not have concrete evidence. Yan Bingyan slowly lowered his eyes. Don't forget, the head of the first bureau Zhu Ge was always the eldest princess man. This case, if you were not in charge of the first bureau and the full cooperation of the other departments, it would have been impossible to find out. So, the situation now is that if you really open this case, Jingdo will be in chaos. He spoke calmly, but Fan Xian could hear a glimmer of coldness behind his words. To be able to find out so quickly, other than the terrifying resources of the Overwatch Council, A large part of it was due to Yan Bingyun's extraordinary ability. It was clear that Yan Bingyun did not want the case he was investigating to throw the seemingly peaceful Qing court into chaos. When it came down to it, Yan Bingyun was not loyal to Fan Xian. He was loyal to the emperor, to the Qing kingdom, and to the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian glanced at him. Do you know what it means to suppress this matter? Yan Bingyun shook his head. I only know that if this matter is opened, your wife will be the one in the most difficult situation. In reality, most of the upper echelons knew that Fan Xian's wife was the eldest princess daughter. It was just that no one had said it. If Fan Xian was determined to expose this matter, without question, no matter how one looked at it, the emperor in the palace would have to make an unusually valiant response. Lin Wanner's situation would inevitably become awkward. Fan Xian's actions after returning to the capital were actually just to make up for his failure in using the paper to force the eldest princess away and ease the conflict in the palace. The result he wanted was to force the emperor, who might have other plans, to strip away the eldest princess' power in the shortest amount of time. I respect my wife. Fan Xian stared at Yan Bingyun with a chill. But I will not slow down my steps because of her difficulties. Yan Bingyun slowly raised his head. There seemed to be some confusion in his eyes. This is something I do not understand. Sir, what exactly do you want to do? 2 reasons. Fan Xian stood up and walked to the window of the study. He looked at the slowly sinking sun. In the corner of the courtyard, a woman was taking care of the branches and leaves of a shrub. The first reason is very simple. The court is currently short of silver. The great river in the south has not been repaired for many years. This year, the dam has failed and hundreds of thousands of people have drowned. Although I have not personally seen it, thinking about it, it is indeed tragic, brother. Where can we find silver for disaster relief? My father has been worrying about this problem these days. The financial situation of the current dynasty is different from that of previous dynasties in history. Long years of military use have used up large amounts of money and grain. Putting aside this, the source is also very strange. A large portion of the national treasury's annual income must come from the palace treasury. The palace treasury is the emperor's treasury. In reality, you and I both know that it is the legacy of the mistress of the Yi family. It is only by relying on the endless silver produced by these industries that the Qing kingdom can be supported. Fan Xian turned his head and narrowed his eyes at Yan Bingyun. The eldest princess is a person who loves to play with power. Over the years, the silver of the palace treasury has gradually been scattered into the hands of officials in exchange for her and him loyalty and power. To put it bluntly, this is using the emperor's silver to poach the emperor's officials. The silver has been spent on internal strife and officials. In this world where silver is needed, where can we find silver? Silver is just silver. How to use it is a big problem. Rather than letting it rot in the officials' residences, it is better to force it out and fill it in the river to scare the ghosts. So, I am in a hurry to investigate the Cui family and the second prince. Otherwise, our eldest princess and the second prince, who only seems to like reading, will generously give away all the silver of the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and seemed to feel a little emotional. He smiled bitterly and said, "Of course, after this matter is exposed, the emperor will probably not punish his own sister." Chapter 271. Don't think I'm a saint. Fan Xian shook his head. In the end, I'm thinking for myself. Taking over the palace treasury next year? That would be cutting off Xinyang's source of income. How could she support the prince? Could she allow such a thing to happen? The accounts of the palace treasury are clean and tidy. But what about the secret deficit? Do you want me to take it and worry until my hair turns white? Her leftovers from the feast. I don't want to hold this broken plate of food. The palace treasury is a mountain of gold, but also a basin of dirty water. The eldest princess has the Empress Dowager's favor. But what about me? As a foreign official, going to take charge of the palace treasury is a painful thing to do. He said in distress. I wonder if the emperor wants me to be the eldest princess's scapegoat? In the future, when the palace treasury's deficit is investigated, I won't be able to explain it even if I had 800 mouths. Yes, I'm not satisfied, so I'm going to take my mother-in-law's foot-washing water and pour it on herself. If Chen Pingping or Fan Jian heard what he said and saw his expression, they would certainly give him a thumbs up and praise him for being so young. But his acting skills were already at the point of perfection. Foreign official? Foreign my ass. But Yan Bingyan did not know the shocking secret behind the scenes. Hearing Fan Xian admit to his own selfishness, he felt even more admiration in the depths of his heart. He felt that this Sir Fan Jr., who he had always disliked, was actually an upright official. He furrowed his brows and suggested, "Why didn't you reject the palace's proposal in the beginning? The palace treasury is indeed a hot potato." Fan Xian laughed somewhat self-deprecatingly. "Perhaps you won't believe me, but I really do want to do something for the people of the world." Yan Bingyun's appearance was still cold, but the warmth in his heart seemed to have warmed. He stood up and bowed to Fan Xian. He then began to use a steady voice and began to give advice from the perspective of a subordinate. At this time, it is not worth it to touch the palace treasury. Fan Xian looked at him quietly. Yan Bingyan did not seem to feel Fan Xian's aggressive gaze. Because even if this matter is revealed, looking at Sir's recent plans, perhaps he will have the guts to ask Sir Chanli to write an official document and post it on the Supreme Court's wall, letting everyone know how much the eldest princess and the officials in the capital have benefited from the palace treasury. Fan Xian laughed self-deprecatingly. He really did have this plan. In any case, he was bold and had a strong backer. And this backer was not the emperor, but that uncle. "It's useless," Yan Bingyan said seriously. "At least for this year's victims it is useless. The silver that has flowed out of the palace treasury cannot be recovered in a short month. Let's not talk about whether the emperor can make up his mind and offend most of the officials. If there are too many officials to be demoted, the court will have problems operating. The disaster relief cannot be delayed." Fan Xian sank into deep thought and asked, "Then what do you think?" "Put this case on hold for the time being. The minister has been in charge of the national treasury for a long time. He must have his own ways. I don't think he will delay the disaster in the south," Yan Bingyan said quietly. "The things that Sir has arranged in northern Qi also need some time to prepare. After the winter, the council will coordinate with Wang Qinian in the north and south. First, we will uproot the Cui family and cut off Xinyang's path of distribution. Then, we will take advantage of the commissioner's new control of the palace treasury to investigate the accounts and cases. This is the way to be prudent." Fan Xian frowned. "I am just worried that Wang Qinian's time in Shangjing is too short. He cannot completely control the power in the north and uproot the Cui family." Yan Bingyan paused for a moment, then simply replied, "I can help." Fan Xian looked at him. His expression did not change, but he was secretly delighted. "You are now a famous person in northern Qi. How can you go back north?" Yan Bingyan replied, "The men under me do not need me to watch over them. I will try to grasp more and more power, and then use this power to do things that I want to do. In this process, I will need the help of many people." Fan Xian looked into his eyes and said in a low voice, "I really want to be like when we were in Shangjing. You and I can work well together, of course, not just this time, but also next spring." Yan Bingyan understood what he meant. He did not stay silent for long. He lowered his head, saluted and left. The young and handsome men of the Overwatch Council were not sloppy people. However, after Sir Yin Jr. expressed sufficient trust in Sir Fan Jr., he still turned his head back and asked in confusion before he stepped out of the study, "Commissioner, you have lived in luxury since you were a child. Why do you place so much importance on the common people who suffer in the world?" Fan Xian scratched his head and replied, "Perhaps it is because I have long since gotten used to doing good deeds." Sir Yin Jr. is very patient. He still hasn't asked how Miss Shin is doing. He looked out the window at the half-cut shrubs under the setting sun. His face was expressionless, but he sighed to himself. The officialdom was indeed treacherous at every step. Even the Fan manor he lived in had such a skilled spy. Although Fan Xian had officially revealed his identity as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to the Ministry of Justice, and the first bureau's secret agent had tactfully revealed his identity and left, the courtyard was still not quiet. If it weren't for Wu Zhu behind him, he probably wouldn't have noticed the woman planting flowers. Just as he had said, Fan Xian was not a saint, nor was he a good person in the purest sense of the word, and he was certainly not a traitor. The simplest reason for dealing with the eldest princess, as well as the unknown second prince, was because he and Xinyang had long had enmity that could not be solved. And the root of this enmity, the palace treasury, was the thing that Fan Xian would not give up after his rebirth. The palace treasury was the Yi family, and the meaning it carried was something that Fan Xian had no choice but to protect. No matter who tried to stand in his way, Fan Xian would mercilessly kick them aside. But what he had said to Yan Bingyan was not all an act. It was just like what he had said to his sister a long time ago. How should a person live their life? How should Fan Xian live his life? Love himself, love his wife, love his family, love the world, love his own, and love for others. This was not the influence of the DAI television station, but purely from his own heart. Muddle-headed glory, wealth, bullying men and women, this was a life. Honest, wrong, precarious life, this was a life. Leading troops into battle, killing people like scything flax, and unifying the world was a life. Fan Xian was also an ordinary male animal who coveted wealth, enjoyed power, and loved beautiful women. But the experience of two lives had allowed him to accurately grasp what he wanted. So he believed that being free and easy, being cruel when it was time to be cruel, being gentle when it was time to be gentle, being close to more beautiful women, earning more money, and seeing more of the beautiful scenery of this world was the way to live a glorious life. On the premise that his life and material life were guaranteed, he did not mind enjoying his spiritual world. But for the world to be beautiful, it first had to make the people who lived in it smile. So Fan Xian, the poor official, inevitably felt a little tired at the beginning. If he had maintained the clear and murderous state of mind of the youth from Danzhou, perhaps he would have become a lot more free and happy. The palace treasury, and the people of the world, would not have made him think too much. But in the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, that bit of unnecessary curiosity about his fiancée made him fall into the river of love, into family, and deeper. He could no longer live freely in this world. This fact tells us that as a man, getting married too early is always a very stupid thing to do. That afternoon Fan Xian, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and Yan Bingyun, the alternate head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had a conversation in fan manner about the palace treasury, the second prince, and the people of the people. The contents of this conversation were quickly sent through the most secretive channel of the Qing kingdom, to the royal study in the royal palace, and to Chen Pingping's table. Chen Pingping's reaction was very simple. He immediately wrote an order, temporarily delegating his authority over the entire council to Fan Xian. In other words, before Chen Pingping retracted this order, Fan Xian could legitimately mobilize all the power of the enormous and terrifying Overwatch Council. And in the royal study, the Supreme Emperor of the Qing Kingdom looked at the report on the table and only nodded lightly. In His Majesty's heart, he was very pleased with Fan Xian's actions these past few days. Since the officials and the people of the world all believed the Overwatch Council to be his dog, then this dog must have the courage and ruthlessness to bite people. But it must not bite anyone it met. By making Fan Xian the dog's leash, the emperor wanted to see just how capable he was. After the conversation with Chen Pingping 9 months ago, although the emperor did not say anything, he had tacitly agreed to the fact that Fan Xian had taken over the Overwatch Council. In the future, he would have to let the child know his true identity as the son of the emperor, but because of his birth, he could never sit on the throne. Presumably, the child would be very satisfied with this arrangement. Of course, His Majesty appreciated this afternoon's conversation between Fan Xian and Yan Bingyan even more. The emotions that naturally flowed through the conversation were very similar to that woman from back then. A trace of a gratified smile flashed across the emperor's thin face. Although the child's words were somewhat disrespectful toward him, he could guess the loyalty beneath those words. He looked at the eunuch in front of him and smiled. Hong Xiang, what do you think of this? Fan Xian? Eunuch Hong bowed slightly. There was not a trace of emotion on his aged face. Too fake. The emperor furrowed his brows and didn't say anything. He wondered if Fan Xian was putting on an act for him to see. However, he had heard that the fifth prince had always been in the south. No one in the capital should have been able to detect his arrangements. Your Majesty, how should we handle this? Eunuch Hong asked, naturally, about the matter between the second prince and the eldest princess. The emperor coldly shook his head. The play hasn't even begun. How can it be stopped so soon? This emperor of the kingdom of Qing had always been troubled by the emptiness of the national treasury. Although he had always had his suspicions about Xinjiang, he had never found any concrete evidence. And because of the Empress Dowager's health, the emperor, who had always been loyal and filial, could not ferociously tear open everything under the curtains. After all, Li Yunrui had done more for the kingdom of Qing than he had done wrong. After all, the second prince was his own son. It was only now that he truly believed Chen Pingping's words. In some matters, although young people could appear a little rash, they could also display sufficient ability and boldness. Not to mention Fan Xian. It seemed that the emperor had not paid enough attention to the young official, named Yan Bingyan. The serving girls lit the candles and left. The royal study was silent. The emperor quietly waited for Fan Xian's memorial. If Fan Xian had truly guessed his intentions, and was willing to follow his arrangements to be a lonely official, then by tonight at the latest, he should have found out and delivered the information to the emperor's desk. And if Fan Xian really did as Yan Bingyan wanted and suppressed this matter, the emperor frowned. Even if Fan Xian was considering things for the stability of the court, as the emperor, he could not allow such deception. With a creak, the door to the royal study opened. A eunuch walked in carrying 2 boxes of memorials. The emperor had always been diligent. Reading memorials until late at night had already become a rule in the royal palace. The emperor's expression did not change, but he was waiting for something in his heart. When he saw the secret memorial box at the very bottom, a warm smile appeared on his lips. He opened the Overwatch Council's special secret memorial box and began to carefully read the first memorial Fan Xian had written since entering officialdom. The secret memorial. After a long time, he put the memorial to the candle and burned it. He gently coughed, picked up the red brush, and wrote 2 words on a piece of white paper. He then sealed it back into the secret memorial box. In his heart, this memorial, which could change the fate of many people, was not a big deal. On the road to the pinnacle of power, the emperor had already seen through many things. It was different from what many factions, including Fan Xian, secretly guessed. He did not care at all about how his son and sister would make a fuss, because no one could truly understand the emperor's ambition and confidence. But the emperor was very satisfied with Fan Xian's performance, because he knew that Fan Xian was not standing on the Eastern Palace's side to attack the second prince. So when the emperor, who was comforted, began to read the memorial at the back, his thin face suddenly showed incomparable anger and disdain. The Imperial Censorate collectively accused Fan Xian, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council and head of the First Bureau, of corruption, taking bribes, and arrogance. The memorials were like pairs of provocative eyes staring at the emperor's gloomy face. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.